Chapter 188. The round stones at the bottom of the shallow stream trembled slightly, as if they wanted to leave, but they didn't move at all. They only struggled to make some small whirlpools, and then rose up, passing through the dense water plants, bringing along the air bubbles attached to the bottom of the grass. This proves that the talisman is effective, but the effect is too weak, so it can only be displayed with the buoyancy of the stream. Fourth brother looked at the pearl-like air bubbles in the stream and asked indifferently, "Youngest brother, I appreciate your idea that you are willing to use your talisman Taoism in practical things instead of metaphysics. But I don't understand why you want the talisman to be so small. Where are you going to use it?" Ning Ke said after a moment of silence, "I'm going to carve this talisman on the arrow, so it must be small." Fourth brother turned back and looked at him quietly, saying, "Good idea." Ning Ke smiled, but he heard fourth brother's next words before his smile was fully stretched. "Unfortunately, it's still wishful thinking." He asked in surprise, "Why?" Fourth brother said, "Carving talismans on armors can increase defense, and carving talismans on swords can increase lethality. Has no one ever thought of carving talismans on arrows? Since ancient times, countless people have had this idea, but they all failed." Ning Ke frowned and asked, "Why did they fail?" "There are thousands of reasons, but there is only one real explanation. Because all the attempts to carve talismans on arrows have failed. So at least until today, this is a good idea destined to fail. Failure is the mother of success." Youngest brother's words are very reasonable, but don't forget that many mothers gave birth to children who were also failures. It doesn't matter if I try again, does it? Then you have to redesign the talisman lines. Now your talisman can only be carved on the beam of the Daming Palace. Even if you have the ability to turn the beam of the Daming Palace into an arrow, where can you find such a thick bowstring? Fourth brother, I just found out that you are very mean today. A talisman master like me, who plays technical work, pays particular attention to carving on the thinnest part. Good answer. It was not Ning Ke's first idea to carve talismans on arrows to increase power and shooting range. As a matter of fact, he already had this idea when he was listening to the old man Liu Qingchen talking about the secrets of cultivation on the grassland last year. Years of training in Min Mountain and the frontier fortress had given him excellent archery skills. Every time he thought about how to fight against strong cultivators, he would naturally think of bows and arrows. If talisman Taoism could be used on feathered arrows, then a safe distance and surprise attack could be guaranteed in a battle with a cultivation powerhouse. When Liu Qingchen heard about this idea last year during the journey, he immediately said that the arrow was too light to carve talismans on it, and the primordial qi attached to it would dissipate too quickly. Unless these two problems could be solved, the arrow would never become the weapon of choice for cultivators. At that time, Ning Ke had never touched talisman Taoism, so he did not think much about it. However, as the successor of the divine talisman master Yen Sei, and seeing so many crazy sublime people in the back of the mountain of the academy, he always felt that it was not impossible to carve a talisman on the thin shaft of an arrow. If he succeeded, wouldn't all the problems be solved? Although he was beaten by fourth brother's mean words by the stream, Ning Ke did not lose all his confidence. After returning to Chang'an, he broke into the South School of Haotian Taoism to find his master and pestered him for 3 days and 2 nights to get some advice. Then, he returned to the old brush pen shop and pondered for a long time with a brush, ink, ruler and line. Finally, he reduced the wind talisman to the smallest size. Late at night, the light was slightly swaying. Sang Sang, who was wrapped in white cloth, slowly floated up from the bed. The white cloth was densely covered with slender strips of paper. Some strange lines could be vaguely seen on the paper. A low whimper came from the closed window. Ning Ke stood beside the bed with a pale face and looked at her quietly. The scene looked extremely strange and terrible. Ning Ke's psyche power and his sense of perception was almost exhausted after drawing more than 40 wind talismans. His face was extremely pale, but his eyes were full of joy when he looked at the little handmaiden who slowly floated up and the paper talismans on her body. As Sang Sang's thin body floated in the air, He moved his hands up and down and said with emotion, "What is a trapeze artist?" "This is a trapeze artist. This is a magic trick." "How can I know who Lu Qian is?" Sang Sang, who was floating in the air, frowned and said, "Young master, I don't know who Lu Qian is either." The next day, Ning Ke came to the back mountain of the academy. He took out the slender fu paper and handed it to sixth brother very solemnly. He said, "Senior brother, it depends on your craftsmanship." Sixth brother took the fu paper and looked at it for a long time in confusion. Then he picked up an arrow from the corner of the room that Ning Ke threw here a few days ago. He rolled the fu paper into a cylinder and stuck it tightly on the thin shaft of the arrow. "Although the size is suitable, I still think it will fail later." Sixth brother took out a fine carving knife and sat at the bright place of the window. He began to carve according to the lines of the fu paper on the shaft of the arrow. His fingers were very stable and did not tremble at all. His knife seemed to be slow, but in fact, it was extremely accurate. He did not want to be elegant but only practical. The hair-like blade perfectly copied the lines on the fu paper. After carving the fu, Ning Ke picked up the arrow and looked at the sky outside the window. Looking at the delicate and beautiful lines on the thin shaft-like patterns, he could not help but feel shocked and sincerely praised. "Sixth brother, your craftsmanship is really good." Sixth brother put the fine carving knife into the leather case and said with a simple and honest smile, "I am a craftsman." The two walked out of the room and came to the mirror lake. Ning Ke took a deep breath and calmed his mind. He put the arrow on the boxwood bough and slightly loosened and tightened his left fingers. His psyche power was released from his sense of perception and passed to the talisman lines on the arrow. For an ordinary talisman master, his psyche power was the key and the talisman he wrote was the lock. Only his psyche power could stimulate the power of the talisman. With a buzzing sound, the tight boxwood bowstring bounced back. Almost at the same time, his psyche power stimulated the talisman on the shaft. A breeze blew between the hard bough and then quickly dispersed. But the arrow did not know where it flew to. There was no trace of the arrow flying on the calm lake. There was no trace of the arrow flying in the forest across the lake. Under the azure sky, not a single trace of an arrow could be found. There must be traces of anything walking, crawling, or flying. So where did the arrow engraved with wind talisman disappear in an instant? Ning Ke put down the hardwood bough in a daze and looked back at sixth brother with an inquiring look. Sixth brother spread out his hands with a confused expression on his simple and honest face. Just then, seventh sister walked out of the pavilion in the center of the mirror lake. Her eyebrows were furrowed and she was furious. Her head and body were covered with tiny sawdust, as if she had just crawled out of a lumberyard warehouse. Looking at seventh sister's embarrassed appearance, Ning Ke could not help laughing, thinking that senior sister was really like a silly girl. Sixth brother forged weapons and carved talismans all year round. He was simple and honest, but his eyes were sharp. He had already seen seventh sister's clenched right hand trembling because of anger and a cold metal arrowhead in her palm. His body slightly stiffened and his heart slightly chilled. Without saying anything, he turned around and went into his iron forging room, closing the door tightly. Ning Ke still did not know what had happened. He looked back at the closed iron forging room in confusion, and then turned back to seventh sister in the pavilion and shouted, "Senior sister, did you see an arrow?" Seventh sister suppressed her anger and forced a smile. "What arrow?" "It's just an arrow with a fancy shaft." Seventh sister smiled and stretched out the arrowhead in her right hand. She asked, "Is it this one?" Ning Ke said in surprise, "Yes, it is this." Why is there only an arrowhead? Where is the pole?" Seventh sister gently brushed the hair on her cheeks and dusted the sawdust in her hair. She smiled charmingly and said, "Here." Ning Ke finally came to his senses. Without hesitation, he turned around and ran to the iron forging room, shouting, "Sixth brother! Help! Open the door!" Before he reached the iron forging room, Ning Ke stopped running with a muffled sound. He struggled to turn his head to look behind him. His face was pale and he almost cried. There were more than a dozen embroidery needles on his buttocks, each needle piercing into his flesh. In the pavilion, seventh sister gently pinched the embroidery frame and sneered, "Knives, swords, needles, and now arrows. If I don't teach you some lessons, I really don't know whether you will also use firearms in the future." After the small interlude, the innovative work of developing talisman arrows still had to continue. And because of the noise by the lake, there were two more onlookers. Chinpipi had just sent food to the chess addict and had nothing to do for the time being. Seventh sister, on the other hand, had to guard against the sawdust rain in the pavilion in the middle of the lake. It was really difficult for her to concentrate on embroidery, so she simply came over to watch. Even if talismans can be carved on the shaft, the power of wind talisman plus flux energy is not something that the shaft itself can bear. Seventh sister held a pot lid and patted the remaining sawdust on her shoulder. She looked at Ning Ke and sixth brother who were concentrating on the experiment and said, "If we can't solve this problem, it's useless to try. Has anyone ever tried this before?" "Yes." "Have they succeeded?" "No." "Are those former divine talisman masters more talented than you, Ning Ke?" "Yes." "Have they succeeded?" "No." "So I don't know why you still insist on this idea." Chinpipi held the fine iron pot used for delivering food and shook his head. He said, "You are purely wasting time and life." The two onlookers seemed to be giving ideas at the same time, but in fact, they had never given up any opportunity to strike Ning Ke's confidence. Ning Ke didn't care about it. He directly pulled the bow and arrow and said, "Get ready." The fourth experiment of the unprecedented new talisman arrow. Countdown starts. 3, 2, 1, shoot. Chinpipi shouted loudly. When he shouted the word launch, he immediately raised the fine steel pot in his hand to cover his face. However, because his face was too fat and round, even though the steel pot was huge, a circle of flesh was still exposed. It looked extremely comical and ridiculous. Seventh sister was faster than him. When he shouted the word shoot, she had already raised the pot lid with both hands and desperately protected her beautiful face. Even Ning Ke, after shooting the talisman arrow, immediately jumped to the back of sixth brother and blocked any possible accidents with senior brother's strong body. The first 3 talisman arrows had caused extremely tragic consequences. The fish with white bellies on the surface of the lake and the black bird that had been blown into a bloody mess in the forest were the direct evidence of this tragedy. Sixth brother did not cover his face and carefully looked for the trace of the talisman arrow in the sky. As a weapon developer and manufacturer, he never lacked the spirit of adventure. After a while, he shook his head and said, "Done." Seventh sister carefully poked out half of her face from behind the pot lid and asked, "Senior brother, where is the arrow?" Sixth brother pointed to the dense forest on the other side of the lake and said, "It seems to be over there." Chinpipi put down the fine iron pot and said with a laugh, "That's where the 2 senior brothers play the zither and flute." Seventh sister waved her hand and said, "It's okay. Once the 2 junior brothers start to play the zither and flute, they won't remember anything. Not to mention being drenched with sawdust, even if their butts are pierced by an arrow, they won't have any reaction." Hearing this, Ning Ke slightly trembled and said to sixth brother, "It seems that the material of the arrow shaft is really not good." Sixth brother took out the last talisman arrow from the quiver and asked, "Do you still want to try?" Chinpipi shook his head and said, "It doesn't make any sense. If Ning Ke can successfully develop the talisman arrow, he can totally set up a sect. He doesn't need to learn the true meaning of talisman Taoism." "I know you are scolding me." Ning Ke shrugged and said, "But I still want to have a try." Looking at Chinpipi and seventh sister nervously lifting the pot and the pot lid again, he smiled and shook his head, saying, "This time I will try on the spot, without covering my face." Taking off the arrowhead on the talisman arrow, Ning Ke released the psyche power in his sense of perception and directly stimulated the talisman on the arrow shaft. The beautiful and delicate talisman lines on the arrow shaft suddenly lit up, and the surrounding chi of heaven and earth quickly gathered together. A cool breeze was generated out of nowhere and kept twining around the slender arrow shaft. Ning Ke stared at the arrow shaft and used his psyche power to carefully perceive the direction and law of the flow of the wind. Suddenly, everyone could see with their naked eyes that the talisman lines on the thin and long arrow shaft sank deep into the arrow shaft for some unknown reason. The wood that made up the arrow shaft instantly tightened and then tore apart, splitting into extremely fine wood fibers. With a puff, smoke and dust rose by the lakeside and sawdust flew all over the sky. It caused a lot of coughs. Ning Ke brushed off the sawdust on his body and said, "Ordinary materials can't be used to make talisman arrows. We have to change them." "Change what?" "Use refined steel." Chen Pipi shook his head and said, "Refined steel can naturally resist the tearing force of the wind. But the problem is, how to shoot arrows made of refined steel. How can there be such a bowstring in the world? The bow can be made of iron, and the string can also be solved. The problem is that the refined steel arrow is so heavy that I can't shoot it even with my ability." Seventh sister asked, "Will the refined steel arrow be lighter after engraving the talisman?" Ning Ke shook his head and said, "Fourth brother and I have tried it a few days ago. Even if it's light, it's still limited." Sixth brother suddenly said, "I can use refined steel to make the hollow tube." Chen Pipi said, "In order to strengthen the strength of your perception of the talisman on the arrow shaft, I suggest you add some silver in it." Sixth brother nodded and said, "This is not difficult." Ning Ke's eyes gradually lit up. "First of all, thank you. Then please continue to recommend and vote for your monthly support. Finally, these plots are naturally to provide great help for Ning Ke's next volume. Whether you like it or not, please like it. Because I write this book with the idea of making the world happy. Haha. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 189. Sixth brother looked at Ning Ke and said, "If the material of the arrow shaft is changed to mixed silver, your talisman must be redesigned. I will make some mixed silver later, and you can take it back to try." Ning Ke thought of the little handmaiden floating in the old brush pen shop in the middle of the night, scratched his head and said, "Sixth brother, please help me prepare more materials. The previous talisman was very light, and it seems that it should be heavier this time." Seventh sister threw the pot lid to Chen Pipi and clapped her hands. She looked at the two people in discussion and asked doubtfully, "Why don't you ask Master Yen Sei to carve talismans on the arrow shaft? Won't the talismans carved by divine talisman masters be better?" For ordinary talisman masters, the talismans they wrote could only be activated by their own psyche power frequency, but this rule was not applicable to divine talisman masters with mysterious states. Divine talisman masters like Master Yen Sei were able to seal the chi of heaven and earth on the talisman paper. As long as the user controlled the chi of heaven and earth with his psyche power, the power of the talisman could be activated. The importance of divine talisman masters to national armies and sects was reflected here. However, divine talisman masters had such a high status that ordinary martial cultivators were not qualified to ask them to specially make weapons for themselves. What's more, if the armors and weapons of martial cultivators wanted to bear the powerful talisman carved by divine talisman masters, they needed enough high-quality or even rare materials. But rare materials must be expensive, which was one of the important reasons why divine talisman weapons were extremely rare. Ning Ke was about to explain the difference between the two to seventh sister when fourth brother, who had been silent for a long time in the dark corner of the room, said, "The talismans carved by divine talisman masters are powerful, but they are others' talismans after all. It's better for youngest brother to carve his own talisman for the close-range weapons he needs. The two can communicate with each other and even change according to the surrounding environment, which is very good for improving his state and enhancing his fighting advantage." After a short pause, he continued, "People like youngest brother who have a great lucky chance can ask Master Yen Sei to carve talismans for him at any time, but he can't do that. Once he becomes dependent on the fixed divine talisman, it will be more difficult for him to make progress. What's more, the talismans on the weapons are not made by himself. If they are damaged, where can he repair them? A few days ago, Ning Ke wanted to ask his master to carve a talisman on his weapon. At that time, Master Yen Sei's answer was very similar to fourth brother's. He could not help but nod. Suddenly, he thought of the thing that Chin Pippi mentioned when he first entered the back of the mountain of the academy. He looked at fourth brother and asked curiously, "Fourth brother, the armor of General Xiahou." Fourth brother replied, "The divine talisman armor on Xiahou is a divine talisman designed by Professor Huang He himself. Your sixth brother and I are just blacksmiths and carvers, and we did some technical work." Thinking of the general who wore the divine talisman armor and had been victorious in the Yen territory for more than 10 years, Ning Ke smiled with mixed feelings after a long time of silence. He shook his head and sighed, "We, the 4 border generals of the Tang Empire, are really honored to be able to invite a divine talisman master like Professor Huang He to make talismans and 2 senior brothers to make armor with great care." Fourth brother shook his head expressionlessly and said, "The 4 generals have no influence on the academy. Although I'm not a divine talisman master, General Su sure can't ask me to do anything if I don't want to. After all, it's because of Professor Huang He. Since he has asked, we can't refuse." "Is Professor Huang He familiar with General Xiahou?" Ning Ke asked casually. Fourth brother looked up at him and said after a moment of silence, "Professor Huang He is a visiting professor of the Imperial Center Administration. It's his duty to enhance the strength of the Imperial military." Hearing the words, Imperial Center Administration, Ning Ke remembered the token hidden in his belt. Since His Majesty gave him the token, he had never visited the Imperial Center Administration. He only knew that it was an institution used by the Empire to manage cultivators. He couldn't help but wonder if he could get some benefits from his identity in the Imperial Center Administration. Walking stones at the bottom of the stream and testing arrows by the lake, time seemed to pass much faster in the back mountain of the academy than in the outside world. Seeing that the sun was setting and the light was getting darker, Ning Ke took the heavy mixed silver wrought iron wrapped in leather from sixth brother, saluted to senior brothers and sisters with hands folded in front, and then walked out of the mountain. Chin Pippi saw him out of the mountain. Before entering the fog, he suddenly stopped and asked with doubt on his chubby face, "Did Master Yen Sei really say that your aptitude in talisman Taoism can be ranked in the top 3 in history?" Ning Ke patted his shoulder and comforted him. "Are you feeling a little lost, lonely, and cold because you finally found that you can't compare with me in cultivation? Think about it. You can't enter talisman Taoism, why do you compare with me in this? Think about Lu Bai, the sage of sword, he can't catch up with me in this aspect." Hearing that Ning Ke compared himself with the most powerful man in the world, Chin Pippi's mood didn't improve immediately. He replied sarcastically, "I am a grand cultivator in the knowing destiny state. Do you think I will envy you, a mere no-doubt state cultivator? That's not what you said." Ning Ke retorted with a smile, "I have only cultivated for a year and jumped from the initial state to the no-doubt state. Who can be sure that I can't enter the knowing destiny state in the future? You only have 10 acupoints in the ocean of Qi and mountain of snow. You have to admit that your aptitude is inferior." Chin Pippi looked at him sympathetically and said, "Even if the headmaster of the academy forcibly teaches your wooden head to the knowing destiny state, so what? You are just a wooden head in the knowing destiny state." Ning Ke frowned and said, "The ocean of Qi and mountain of snow is blocked, but it doesn't mean that my head is blocked." Chin Pippi stood in front of the fog on the mountain path and looked back at him with a smile. He said, "Anyway, I'm not sure whether your aptitude in talisman Taoism is in the top 3 in history. But I can be sure that even if you enter the knowing destiny state, you must be the weakest one in history. You can't influence the Qi of heaven and earth more than 3 feet away from you. How can you call yourself a grand cultivator then?" When he mentioned grand cultivators, he deliberately emphasized the word grand cultivator and bit down on it. Ning Ke's face had long been trained in the cold wind of Min Mountain and the wild sand of the frontier fortress. He didn't care about Chin Pippi's sarcasm at all. He just thought that it was a pity that he hadn't seen the legendary headmaster of the academy and eldest brother since he entered the second floor of the academy for several months. He thought that if he could be taught by the headmaster of the academy, how fast would his cultivation progress be? When will the headmaster and eldest brother come back? No one knows. Traveling abroad, there will be a time when they come back, right? It's been more than a year. Traveling to enjoy the scenery and visiting friends is much happier than cultivating in the back mountain. If it were me, I wouldn't be willing to come back. Ning Ke looked at him with a smile and asked, I heard that the headmaster only took eldest brother when he traveled around the world these years. Why didn't he take you? Last year in the old library, you bragged every day that you were the favorite of the headmaster of the academy. It doesn't seem like it. Chen Pippi shook his head and said with emotion, You don't understand. The world respects the headmaster of the academy and doesn't dare to disrespect him. As students, of course, no one can serve the headmaster of the academy well like eldest brother. If it were you, would you take a spoiled daughter out or a wife who can cook? It was a very absurd question, but Ning Ke actually began to seriously think about it while standing in front of the fog on the mountain path. After thinking for a long time, he answered, I will take care of Sang Sang. She can cook and serve. The summer in the wilderness was about to end. The temperature of the fertile grassland gradually cooled down and the color of the grass on the black mud gradually faded. However, the grassland in the north far away from the central plains was still a lively scene. Countless tents were connected like clouds, and people were slaughtering sheep and barbecuing meat, singing and dancing merrily. After countless tragic and bloody battles, the desolate man who migrated from the extremely cold north to the hot south finally defeated the grassland barbarians will to resist after 1,000 years. The left king's palace paid the price of thousands of elite cavalrymen's deaths, but still could not stop the desolate man's unyielding footsteps. They had to move all the tribes close to the north to the grasslands and pastures further south, leaving the fertile grasslands in the north to the desolate man. The brave desolate man warriors won and had a new home in their homeland 1,000 years ago. This homeland was cold and harsh in the eyes of the Central Plains people. But for the suffering people who lived in the extremely cold north all year round, it was undoubtedly as beautiful as heaven. Not long ago, the women and children of the desolate man tribe, who had been lagging behind because of the slow migration, finally arrived at this new homeland. The number of people who successfully arrived far exceeded the desolate man's expectation when they decided to migrate south, which made all the desolate man even more surprised. In the tents of the grassland, relatives reunited and settled down in their own homes. They were familiar with the beautiful but strange new life. The smell of milk from the mutton soup and the smell of burnt dung mixed together and smelled extremely happy to the desolate man. The party lasted from night to the evening of the next day. The desolate man warriors used the liquor they robbed from the grassland palace to reward themselves and their hard-working families. Then they reminisced about their relatives who died on the way or hugged their wives tenderly and returned to their tents to sleep. The oil lamps did not need to be lit at all. The tent in the northwest of the grassland, which looked simple but was obviously much larger, was brightly lit. More than 10 braziers were hanging in the air half a person's height, brightly illuminating the tent. The elders of the desolate man and the most powerful warrior leaders celebrated the victory for a whole day. But then they fell into deep thought and silence because of a certain topic brought up by an elder. What's so scary about the Tangs? A leader of the desolate man warriors, who was as strong as a bear, looked at the old elders in confusion. He said in a low voice, We are all natural warriors. Even when we are tired from migrating thousands of miles to the south, we can still defeat the palace on the grassland. As long as we rest on this grassland for half a year, who in the world can be our match? The desolate man elder sitting in the deepest part of the tent looked at him calmly. After a moment of silence, he said, No matter how strong a warrior is, once he is controlled by pride, he will become weak. The strong leader of the desolate man warriors looked flustered after being criticized by the highly respected first elder. He quickly bowed his head and asked for forgiveness. However, it was clear from his eyes that he still did not understand the fear of his elders. This grassland was originally the hometown of the desolate man. We were once the most powerful kingdom in the world. But why were our ancestors forced to leave this fertile grassland 1,000 years ago and go to the cold region of the far north to suffer? The elder looked around at the people in the tent and said expressionlessly, "Because the Tangs defeated us." After a long silence, the elder continued, "I want you to remember the reason why our ancestors were forced to leave the grassland, not to seek revenge, but to remind you how powerful the Tang Empire is. 1,000 years ago, our ancestors swept across the mainland and no one dared to resist. Even the West Hill Divine Kingdom only wanted to preach at the beginning and had no hostility. Until the Li Tang Empire was founded, our ancestors were defeated again and again. In the end, they almost lost their race. They signed an agreement with the Tang Empire and retreated to the cold region, swearing not to return to the south. Only then did they retain some of their seeds." The elder slowly told the stories of the desolate man that had been passed down from generation to generation. There was a dead silence in the tent. Our ancestors' territory was 100 times larger than ours, and their population was 100 times larger. Their experts were as numerous as the stars in the night sky. But they still died in the hands of the Tangs. Now our tribe has suffered in the hot sea for 1,000 years, but we only have a few 100,000 people. How can we be compared to our ancestors? How can we look down on the Tangs? What we need to worry about now is how to deal with the Tangs once we come into contact with them." There was a reply in the tent, "We don't want the land of the Central Plains. We snatched back our own grassland. Even if the barbarian royal court is driven to the south by us and they have a dispute with the Central Plains, what does that have to do with us?" Someone said worriedly, "Our tribe's move to the south is a violation of the agreement we signed with the Tangs 1,000 years ago. If the Tangs use this as an excuse, how should we deal with it?" The elder looked down and said, "The left king's court, the right king's court, and the golden king's court. After 1,000 years, there are only some barbarians left on the grassland. And we, the real descendants of the heavenly Khan, are forced to live a difficult life beside the hot sea. It's fine if we can survive, but since we can't, moving to the south is inevitable. The night is ahead and death is behind. Any agreement is meaningless." Then he looked up at the most important people in the desolate man's tribe and said in a low voice, "But if we can avoid a war with the Tang Empire, we must. If the Tangs send an envoy to question us, we must deal with it well." Everyone in the tent agreed in unison. Suddenly, the elder noticed that the person was not in the tent. He could not help but frown. Although that person would never express any opinions in the meeting of the elders and was used to being silent, he was after all the most powerful warrior of the desolate man. It was not right that he was not present when such an important matter was being discussed. "Where did he go?" "I don't know." Just as the old man was about to say something, he suddenly sensed a faintly discernible aura coming from the far west. He could not sense how powerful the aura was, but the unique aura deeply touched his old heart. The elder's body suddenly stiffened and his face revealed a look of awe and fear. He hurriedly moved his body backward and knelt down towards the west. He stretched out his hands in front of him, looking unusually respectful. The skinny elders beside him also felt the aura from the west. Their expressions changed drastically and they quickly bent down on the carpet and sincerely reached out their hands to kowtow. The middle-aged leaders of the desolate man tribes did not feel the aura. They could not help but feel shocked and confused when they saw the reaction of the elders. They subconsciously knelt down and kowtowed to the west. Thinking about the new year, I was so happy and excited that I couldn't sleep again. I didn't sleep for a day and night, so I wrote a chapter and then write the next one. When I am too sleepy, I will update as much as I have written. I am so crazy. If you like this work, please come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 190. There was an ox cart on the wilderness. It was an ordinary wooden cart. The wheels of the cart were slightly deformed after traveling for thousands of miles. It squeaked from time to time as it traveled on the hardened grassland. It shook up and down and left an invisible track. It passed through the soft grass and the ruts were deep. There were a few tiny fish jumping in the muddy water that seeped out. The cow was an ordinary big yellow cow. Its legs and hooves were still strong even after traveling for thousands of miles. It walked on the slightly hard grassland and let out low moos from time to time. It moved up and down to feed on the grass, leaving a trace of grass that couldn't be seen. It passed through the soft grass and the ox's hooves were deep. There were a few white weeds lying in the shallow puddles. It was an ordinary wooden cart on the official road of the Central Plains and an ordinary yellow ox in the fields of the Central Plains. However, it was unusual for them to appear in the wilderness. If anyone could see this scene, they would find it very magical. The person driving the ox cart was a scholar with straight eyebrows and wide eyes. The dusty journey had made the old cotton robe on his body look even older, but the expression on his face looked even more simple and amiable. For some reason, the pair of worn-out straw sandals on the single shaft had not fallen apart after walking on the road for more than a year. The water ladle on his waist swayed slightly with the rise and fall of the ox cart. Suddenly, a song came from the ox cart. "You always don't let me go home. It makes me worry so much. Yo yo." The scholar driving the ox smiled and patted the back of the ox to signal it to stop. Then he turned to the carriage behind him and said, "Headmaster, do you want to go home?" The curtain was lifted. A tall, gray-haired old man walked out. He rubbed his waist and stretched his arms. Looking at the boundless wilderness, he said angrily, "I've been out for more than a year, but I've been wandering around in these desolate places with nothing to eat and nothing to play. Who doesn't want to go back to Chang'an?" The old man was the headmaster, so the scholar was naturally the eldest brother of the academy. The eldest brother smiled and helped the headmaster get off the cart. Then he took out a low stool from the cart and asked the headmaster to sit down. He comforted him and said, "It's good to see the scenery along the way." The headmaster was very tall. He sat on the low stool and the hem of his cotton robe covered the stool completely. It looked like he was squatting on the grassland and looked a little funny. The headmaster said unhappily, "What scenery is there to see? The hot sea is really frozen. I can't even take a hot spring bath. Although we can't bathe in a hot spring, at least we can eat peony fish." The eldest senior brother comforted him. There was a sea in the cold region of the far north, and there was a volcano at the bottom of the sea. It was not frozen all year round, so it was called the hot sea. In the depths of the hot sea, there was a fish named peony. It was described as plump and tender. If it was cut vertically with a knife, each piece of fish would look like a peony. Perhaps only people like the headmaster and his disciple would know about this. Hearing the words, "peony fish," the headmaster stroked his long beard and nodded in agreement. He said, "Child, I can't agree more with you. As long as there is a peony fish in the stomach, any long and arduous journey will be worth it." The eldest senior brother took out a kitchen knife, a chopping board, and a bucket. He held the ice in his hand and melted the fat and tender peony fish inside. When the fish had melted to 70%, he held the knife and began to cut it raw. The headmaster looked at the peony fish that was still fresh on the chopping board. He stroked his beard and praised, "Food must be fresh and rare to taste good." If this fish was not only found in the hot sea of the far north, how could it be so delicious after being sandwiched by the cold and heat? How could it make people feel the beauty of eating for thousands of miles? The eldest brother smiled and did not reply. He focused on cutting. The peony fish was extremely fat and tender. Even a sharp kitchen knife could not cut into the skin without messing it up. He cut very slowly and carefully. There seemed to be no distance between the two cuts. However, when he lifted the knife, there was already a layer of white fish that was as thin as a cicada's wing. If it's a river fish, you can't cut it too thin. If it's too thin, it will lose its taste. But the peony fish is found in the deep sea and its meat is very elastic. The thinner the better. Child, you have basically mastered some of the principles of the world these years. The headmaster shook his head and praised. He took out soy sauce, a green seasoning, and ginger juice with his left hand and poured them into a bowl. His right hand reached to the chopping board and picked up the thin white fish with his index and middle fingers. He swung it in the bowl like a koi fish swinging its tail and quickly sent it into his mouth. The headmaster closed his eyes to enjoy it as he chewed. His expression was as sweet as the peony fish in his mouth. After a while, he opened his eyes and looked at the kitchen knife on the chopping board. He said hurriedly, "Faster, faster." The eldest brother smiled. His hands did not speed up at all. He still cut slowly and meticulously. The headmaster could not wait any longer. He took the kitchen knife from his hand and sighed. "You are good at everything, but you always do things slowly. I am so worried." The eldest brother explained respectfully, "I am not talented, so I always like to think more before doing things. You have to learn from Mo in this aspect. Think when you should think, and don't think when you shouldn't. Second brother is so talented that I can't compare with him. If he heard you say that, wouldn't he be ashamed to death like he was when he was young?" The headmaster's knife moved like the wind. In just a moment, the chopping board was filled with snowflake-like slices of fish. It really looked like a blooming white peony. The remaining fish bones and internal organs were wrapped in a layer of film and looked as beautiful as a piece of amber. The second brother was free at this time, so he went into the carriage and took 2 pairs of chopsticks. After the headmaster was satisfied, he picked up a few pieces of peony fish and carefully tasted it. Then he sent the amber-like fish bones and internal organs to the mouth of the big yellow bull. It was natural for the big yellow bull to eat grass, but this big yellow bull ate fish. It opened its mouth and swallowed it. It chewed and shook its head from time to time, looking extremely happy. The headmaster was holding a small wine pot and slowly sipped. He suddenly saw this scene and could not help but scold. The bull chewed on the peony. What a waste! How can fish be eaten like this? After saying this, the headmaster took out another precious peony fish from the ice bucket. He rolled up his cotton sleeves and the kitchen knife rose and fell. In a moment, a pile of white peony-like fish appeared on the chopping board. The headmaster used his chopsticks to pick up a piece of peony fish, dipped it in some seasoning, and threw it into the mouth of the big yellow bull. The headmaster did not mean that the big yellow bull was spoiling things by eating the peony fish, but that the way it was eating it was spoiling things because it could not taste the peony fish. The big yellow bull chewed 2 mouthfuls and was stunned at first. Then 2 lines of tears flowed down from the corner of its eyes. It then began to shake its head, bouncing its front hooves and mooing. The eldest brother hesitated and asked, "Headmaster, is it happy or spicy?" The headmaster said, "Of course it's happy." The eldest brother thought that the headmaster's words were always right, so he took the chopsticks and continued to feed the big yellow bull the peony fish. Even the desolate man could not survive in the cold region of the far north. However, this big yellow cow could pull a carriage around and come back safe and sound. Moreover, it was still so strong. Of course, it was not an ordinary big yellow cow. Therefore, it was not difficult to understand that it ate fish and not grass. The eldest brother washed the chopsticks and bowls, then sat on the shaft and stared at the south for a while. He said, "I wonder how the academy is doing now and how much the desolate man's southward impact will be." The headmaster sat cross-legged on the ox cart and read a book. He answered casually, "We'll know when we get back." The eldest brother smiled and looked at the headmaster. He said, "I'm very curious about who entered the second floor." The headmaster looked at the page and said with his head down, "If you want to know, you can go and see for yourself." The eldest brother shook his head and said, "It's too far. We can't go back anytime soon." After saying this, he suddenly stood up and looked at the north of the grassland with a very clean smile on his face. There was a row of very tall black shadows. Looking closely, they were the snowfield dire wolves that were forced to go south with the desolate man in the cold region of the far north. Hundreds of giant wolves lined up like soldiers, and their huge figures gave people a great sense of pressure. However, neither the headmaster nor he had much reaction. On the contrary, the snowfield dire wolves reacted very strangely. To them, the big yellow bull from the Central Plains was as rare as the peony fish and must be delicious. However, for some reason, the snowfield dire wolves, who were known for their ferocity and killing, did not pounce on them. Instead, they all let out shrill cries and retreated in fear, as if they had sensed a terrifying aura that was far beyond their imagination. This group of snowfield dire wolves was the one that fought with the Tang siblings at the mountain pass. The skinny male wolf led the beautiful female wolf away from the rest of the pack and slowly walked towards the ox cart. When they were about a few hundred steps away from the ox cart, the ordinary male wolf stopped and didn't dare to move forward anymore. The skinny ordinary male wolf looked at the ox cart and seemed very excited. Its body trembled slightly and it squatted back, raising its two front paws, looking like a human student saluting to his teacher. The eldest brother looked at the male wolf and said in surprise, "Teacher, isn't this the wolf from 7 years ago? They are actually married." The headmaster smiled and did not say anything. The eldest brother glanced at the headmaster and found that the headmaster did not object. He left the ox cart and walked a few steps towards the ordinary male wolf. He pointed to the northwest of the grassland and said, "Don't continue to the south. There are too many people there. Go that way and there will be a large piece of coniferous forest in another 250 miles. The ordinary male wolf waved its front paws to salute and bent down to touch its head on the ground for a long time. Then it stood up and looked at the ox cart reluctantly. With a sad howl, it led its wife and subordinates to the northwest. "Let's go back to Chang'an." The headmaster rolled up his book, lifted the curtain and walked into the ox cart. The second brother turned his head and looked at the meadow in the distance with a smile. He sat on the shaft and patted the ox's back. The ox cart creaked and went south. Looking at the ox cart gradually disappearing at the end of the grassland, Tang Xiaotang stood up with the sleeping snow wolf cub in her arms. Her face was full of confusion. After a long time, she murmured, "This is the headmaster?" Tang stood beside her and looked at the rut left on the grassland. He nodded. Tang Xiaotang shook her head. She felt that the gluttonous old man was completely different from the headmaster she had imagined. After a moment of silence, Tang said, "I wanted to see if there was a lucky chance for you to become the headmaster's disciple. But since the headmaster did not say anything, it means that the lucky chance is not here yet. We will talk about it in the future." Tang Xiaotang asked in surprise, "You mean the headmaster knows that we are peeping here?" Tang turned around and walked down the meadow. He said, "Since he is the headmaster, he naturally knows everything." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 191. Due to my disordered biological clock, my mental state has always been sluggish. Due to the rush to update, I really didn't have time to check. That's why I've made a lot of mistakes recently. I'd like to apologize to everyone here. As before, after accumulating a certain number of chapters, I will find a day to completely revise it. Although, after I revise it, I doubt that anyone will read it a second time. Here, I would like to express my sincere thanks to fellow reader Long Shang Wuji. He helped me look for mistakes in the book review section, and then I discovered that there were actually so many mistakes in a single chapter. I am ashamed, and I express my sincerest gratitude to him. I want to make a manuscript after the new year. If there is a manuscript, I will try to check and revise it before I publish it. In addition, I will write a year-end summary today or tomorrow. There are some things I want to talk to you about. No other services. Tang Xiaotang reached out and rubbed the soft belly of the snow wolf cub. She thought of the scene she had seen before and looked at her brother's back. She asked curiously, "What happened to that wolf?" Maybe the headmaster saw that wolf many years ago when he traveled to the northern wilderness. The wolf was enlightened probably because of this encounter. Otherwise, how could an ordinary male wolf understand the power of heaven and earth by himself? Tang Xiaotang was shocked. The headmaster can even enlighten a wolf? That's amazing. Brother, who do you think is more powerful, the headmaster or the headmaster? Tang paused and said after a moment of silence, the headmaster was not as powerful as the headmaster. But after he cultivated the 23-year cicada cultivation, I think he is still not as powerful as the headmaster. Brother, you told me a few days ago that most of the civil and military officials of the Tang Empire studied in the academy. The people on the second floor are not to be trifled with. The headmaster has been the dean of the academy for more than 100 years. So one word from the headmaster can shake the Tang Empire? Isn't the emperor worried? About what? It's his throne. How could the headmaster care about something like the throne? Then isn't the emperor worried that the headmaster will affect the politics? Who would want to have a mountain above their heads? Whether the emperor is willing or not, the headmaster has been quietly existing in the south of Chang and city for many years before he was born. As for the small things like politics, why would the headmaster care? Politics are small things? Do you think the headmaster will intervene if we fight with the Tang Empire? If he's really as powerful as you say, how can the tribe resist him? I told you, the headmaster doesn't care about these small things. Tang Xiaotang held the snow wolf cub and quickened her pace to her brother's side. She stared at him with her big bright eyes and asked in surprise, even this kind of thing is a trivial matter? Then what's the big deal? In the eyes of a person like the headmaster of the academy, everything in the world is trivial. As for what really matters in his eyes, how can people like you and I know? Why bother guessing? Where there are people, there will be trouble. Where there are people, there will be trouble. Humans lacked the means to solve this problem. Apart from war and violence, the only way to solve it was to have a meeting. While the desolate men were discussing their next strategy in the meadow, the emperor and ministers of the Tang Empire in the distant south were also having a meeting. The Daming Palace outside Chang and became the emperor's residence every summer. Because it was inconvenient for the ministers to go out of the city, there were fewer political meetings, big or small. There was only a formal court meeting every 3 days. Although it's much cooler outside the Daming Palace than inside the city, it's still a little hot. This tremella soup has been chilled. Drink it quickly before you go back to the city, lest you fall off your horses and annoy me again. Li Zhongyi, the emperor of the Tang Empire, said to the ministers. He took his bowl from eunuch Lin and brought it to his lips, gulping it down. The government affairs that needed the emperor's approval for 3 days were finished. Although the Daming Palace was quiet and pleasant, it was not as comfortable as their own garden. Although the tremella soup was refreshing, it was not as delicious as their own porridge. After the ministers thanked the emperor, they drank the tremella soup as fast as they could and were ready to leave the palace. Just as the ministers were about to leave, the emperor suddenly remembered something. He waved his hand and called them back, saying, "There's another small matter." 3 days ago, the military ministry reported that the cavalry of the left king's palace went deep into the Yan territory and looted the merchants and villages. I thought it was a matter of the Yan kingdom after all, so I didn't want to pay attention to it. But on second thought, it seemed a little inappropriate to completely ignore it. Moreover, it involves the southward migration of the desolate men, so the imperial court has to come up with a strategy to talk to the West Hill and other countries. Hurry up and discuss it. When the minister of the military ministry heard it was about this matter, he hurriedly reported, the troops of the Right King's Palace and the Golden King's Palace did not move. The intelligence department reported that the cavalry of the Left King's Palace did not cause much loss when they entered the Yan Kingdom. What does the people of the Yan Kingdom have to do with me? It's not a matter of loss or not. The emperor slightly raised his eyebrows and a trace of toughness flashed across his gentle face. He said in a low voice, when the Tang Empire was in charge of drawing the boundary line, the Chanyu of the Three Kings' Palace personally signed it. Now the cavalry of the Left King's Palace dares to cross this line. What I care about is why they dare to cross the line. In the eyes of the emperor and ministers of the Tang Empire, the barbarians on the grassland were detestable but could not cause any trouble. Indeed, they did not treat it as a big deal. The minister of the Ministry of Rights lightly stroked his beard. He even had the leisure to think from the perspective of the barbarian royal court. He smiled and said, "The desolate man migrated to the south. These barbarians could not defeat them. The most fertile grassland was occupied by them. They had to live on the grassland and rely on robbing. Speaking of which, they do have some difficulties." The emperor shook his head and said, "Even if they have difficulties, since they were granted titles by the empire, they should have told the imperial court in advance. The imperial court would naturally have arrangements. Now they secretly started to attack without telling us. Of course, we can't do that. We must beat them back first. After we beat them back, I will listen to their difficulties. Your Majesty is wise. Although the left king's palace is harassing the Yan kingdom, they have crossed the line drawn by the empire. This is a provocation to the Central Plains. As the ruler of the Central Plains, the empire must respond." The prime minister nodded slowly. He looked back at the minister of the military ministry and said unhappily, "The general of the army is closest to the Yan territory. He can just send a cavalry to beat the left king's palace back. How can your Majesty worry about such a small matter? Although it is a small matter, we still need to send troops. Moreover, we need to inform capital Cheng in advance if we enter Yan territory to fight in the north. Otherwise, wouldn't the Yan kingdom's emperor and ministers be scared to death?" The minister of the military ministry turned to the direction of the dragon throne and asked seriously, "Your Majesty, I think the empire needs to seriously consider the desolate man migrating to the south. These desolate men violated the 1,000-year agreement and migrated to the south. How should the empire react?" "Don't think I don't know what you mean. Which old general is bored at home and wants to lead troops to war? Don't wars cost money?" The emperor laughed and scolded before continuing. "The intelligence said that after the desolate man occupied the grassland in the north of the wilderness, they tried their best to restrain their people from moving south. They are so far away from the empire. If they don't bother me, I won't bother. We can bring up the agreement from 1,000 years ago when we need to. The arrogant desolate man were beaten by our ancestors and only a few 100,000 people are left. It is meaningless for us descendants to take advantage of them now." In the secluded hall after the court meeting, the nation master of the Tang Empire, Li Qingshan, looked slightly worried. He whispered to the emperor, "The Divine Hall's reaction to this matter is a bit strange. They actually issued an edict for such a small matter. Now the South Jin Kingdom and Yueluan Kingdom should be preparing to help the North. It should have nothing to do with the left king's palace's disturbance. Since the desolate man has returned, they must have smelled the scent of the devil's doctrine." Hearing the words, Divine Hall, the emperor, who was calm but full of confidence in the court meeting, frowned and said, "When Emperor Taizu first established the empire, he joined forces with the West Hill to drive the desolate man out of the wilderness. Decades ago, youngest uncle broke into the devil's doctrine with a sword and killed all the powerhouses of the devil's doctrine left behind by the desolate man. Now that the devil's doctrine has declined, what is the West Hill Divine Hall worried about?" Li Qingshan said, "After all, the devil's doctrine and the desolate man are inextricably linked. Of course the Divine Hall will be more vigilant. This edict has mobilized all the countries to help the North. The West Hill even sent the apologetic knights. In my opinion, other than guarding against the devil's doctrine and helping the Yan Emperor stabilize the border, they also want to show their strength to the world." The emperor looked at his raised right arm and said, "They want to show off their muscles? Who else from the Yueluan Kingdom and the South Jin Kingdom went?" The Imperial Center Administration reported that the Buddhism sect of the Yueluan Kingdom sent some young powerhouses. The Sword Garret of the South Jin Kingdom also sent some people. But what we really need to pay attention to, other than the apologetic knights, is the judicial department of the Divine Hall. The emperor raised his eyebrows and said with a smile, "So, other than expanding their influence, they also need to train their troops. It's even more inappropriate for the Tang Empire not to send someone. It's fine if the Tang Empire doesn't interfere, but if we do, we have to control everything. Then let Xiaohou go and have a look himself. Hearing Xiaohou's name, Li Qingshan frowned and said, wouldn't it seem that we value the barbarians too much if we send the general to deal with these small matters? I know what you are worried about. The emperor looked at him and raised his eyebrows. He said, I want Xiaohou to go personally, not because I value the cavalry of the palace, or even the edict of the divine hall or the young people of the various countries. I want to see Xiaohou himself. Li Qingshan understood what the emperor meant. He shook his head and sighed. General Xiaohou is famous all over the world. If he goes to the north of Yen, he will definitely be the commander of the coalition army. Your Majesty is wise. The emperor suddenly thought of something. He looked up at Li Qingshan and asked, is it the time for the students of the academy to go to the frontier fortress for practice? Li Qingshan answered, the practice in the past years was always in autumn. It's already the end of summer. It's fine to go a few days earlier. Where was the practice originally planned? The southern defender general of the state, Su Shi, went to fight with the southern Marsh Mountain tribe. The emperor shook his head and said, the southern Marsh Mountain tribe said it's spring. I don't want Su Shi to come back because the air there is humid, which is very good for his lung disease. What can the students of the academy do in such a peaceful frontier fortress? Tomorrow, I will write a letter to the academy and ask them to change the place for practice this year. Li Qingshan guessed the emperor's intention. He frowned and asked, leave the north of Yen kingdom and enter the wilderness? Yes. The emperor said, since the West Hill Divine Palace has issued the edict, the young people of all countries should go and show off. Why don't the young people of the empire go? There has been a saying that the young generation of the Tang Empire is lacking in talents and the empire is declining. I want to show the world whether the Tang Empire has young talents or not. Li Qingshan said seriously after a moment of hesitation, Your Majesty, the students of the academy this year, especially the Tang students, are not outstanding. Lin Xuan Wangying is good, but he is still too young. Isn't there still Ning Ke? The emperor said Ning Ke's name naturally, as if he was saying there was meat porridge if there was no rice. Li Qingshan said, Your Majesty, Ning Ke has entered the second floor of the academy. According to the old rules, he doesn't need to go to the frontier fortress for practice. The emperor said, even if he enters the second floor, he is still a student of this year. Let him lead the team. Li Qingshan saw that the emperor was quite determined, so he could not help but persuade him with a bitter smile. Let's not talk about whether the second floor of the academy is too cautious or not. Ning Ke is just a beginner in Talisman Tong, and his cultivation aptitude is ordinary. It can be said that he is the weakest student in the history of the second floor. How can a mere no-doubt state suppress the young talents of all countries? And if something happens to him in the wilderness, how can we explain it to the headmaster when he comes back? The emperor laughed and said, a jade cannot be made into a tool without cutting, and a man cannot become a talent without grinding. You have seen Ning Ke's file in the military ministry. You know what kind of person he is. If he can't survive on the battlefield, who can? Late at night, the Daming Palace was shrouded in starlight and the shadow of the mountains. The wind came from the north, passing through the forest and brushing the grass into the palace. The emperor stood leaning against the railing, looking calm and dignified. He was not as casual as he was in the previous discussion. The palace maids and eunuchs had already been sent far away. It was quiet beside the railing. Only the empress looked at him quietly. She frowned slightly and looked a little worried. Do you think there is really an underworld? If there really was an underworld, where was it? The headmaster travels the world all year round. Is he looking for the underworld? It is said that the desolate man returned to the south because the night in the cold region of the far north has been getting longer these years. Is there really a day when the night covers the stars? The night covers the stars, and the country will not be peaceful. This was a comment that the imperial astronomer came up with after observing the stars many years ago. Because this comment implied that there would be women in the palace in the future, which would be very unfavorable to the empire. Thus, some people led it to the empress, and others to the fourth princess, who was most favored by the emperor. Who knew how much trouble it had caused? After the incident with the imperial astronomer, the empress lived in peace in the palace and did not express any opinions on state affairs. Princess Li Yu was even married off to the grassland because of this incident. The impact was not small. Suddenly hearing these 4 words from the emperor today, the empress' expression changed slightly. After a long silence, she said in a low voice, "Who would have thought that Mr. Ku would charge into the mountains with a single sword? Master died so suddenly that there were many secrets in the sect that could not be passed down in time. But I have never heard of a place called the underworld when I was in the sect." The emperor turned and looked at her gently. He asked, "Your people are returning to the south. Do you not want to take a look?" The empress shook her head slowly and said, 1,000 years ago, the divine hall sent priests to the wilderness to preach. In the end, there was another cultivation method in the world. But that method was recognized by the divine hall as the devil. Since then, the desolate man and the devil's doctrine could not be separated. But since I left the sect many years ago, the desolate man is naturally no longer my people. At this point, she suddenly stopped talking and looked up at the emperor calmly. She asked, "You decided to let Xiahou lead the army in the north of Yen. Do you suspect him?" The emperor turned to look at the mountain in front of the railing. After a moment of silence, he said, "Yes." The empress looked at his side profile and forcibly suppressed the sadness in her heart. She said in a trembling voice, "Many years ago, I, a woman from the devil's doctrine, followed the orders of my master to the south. I tried my best to get close to you and confuse you in order to kill you, the emperor of the Tang Empire. In the end, after I failed, you did not kill me. Instead, you married me and made me the empress." The emperor was reminded of the past. He touched the railing and said emotionally, "Back then, only father, mother, and Qing Shan knew your identity. If not for the headmaster's words, it would have been extremely difficult for us to be together. But, even if the headmaster did not say anything, no matter how much father and mother objected, I would still marry you. Because you are the woman I want to marry." The empress said sadly, "So I don't understand. Your Majesty, why are you always so suspicious of Xiahou when you have so much forgiveness and love for me? He has fought for the empire at the border for many years. Can't he gain some trust from you? Do you still think that he will return to the devil's doctrine or even rebel against the desolate man's tribe?" The emperor turned around and looked into her eyes. He said, "You are wrong. I have never worried that General Xiahou will return to the devil's doctrine or rebel against the desolate man's tribe. He knows very well that any general who wants to rebel will die under the law of the Tang Empire. He killed Murong Linshuang to show his sincerity to the West Hill. He will never be able to return to the devil's doctrine. Whether it is the person who cultivates the 23-year cicada cultivation or the other people in the devil's doctrine, as long as they reappear in the Central Plains, the first thing they will do is to kill him. Don't forget that Murong Linshuang is that person's favorite female disciple." The empress asked in a trembling voice, "Then why do you suspect him?" The emperor said expressionlessly, "I suspect his relationship with the West Hill." The empress laughed bitterly at herself and said, "You know very well why." "Why?" "Because he knows that the West Hill Divine Palace has always suspected him. Because he knows that the West Hill Divine Palace has always suspected your relationship with him. Can the West Hill Divine Palace find evidence from him that you are the former saintess of the devil's doctrine?" The emperor shook his head and said with emotion, "The emperors of the Tang Empire will study with the headmaster in the academy for a period of time. Their learning speed varies. I don't know if I should praise myself or feel sorry that I did not study with the headmaster for a long time. In those short days, the headmaster said something that I remember the most clearly. There are many strong and brave people in the world. After they compromise for the first time, they will continue to compromise. In the end, they will even form some kind of abnormal psychological state. From compromise to active cooperation, they will turn from the victim to the perpetrator, and they don't even understand why it happened. The West Hill Divine Palace has been guessing your true identity all these years. They tried their best to test it. Xia Ho tried his best to cover up for you and make friends with the West Hill Divine Palace. He did not hesitate to cooperate with the West Hill Divine Palace to make trouble when I was not in Chang'an. He did not hesitate to let the villages in the Yen territory die because of the West Hill Divine Palace. He even did not hesitate to kill his most beloved woman. In my opinion, these are really unnecessary. Even if the West Hill Divine Palace knows that my empress is the saintess of the devil's doctrine, what can they do? The emperor patted the railing and looked at the stars in the night sky. He sighed and said, "If Xia Ho did not do these things because of you, I would have killed him many years ago." I thought that as time passed, he would understand these things, but it seems that he has not changed. He left the devil's doctrine many years ago. Unfortunately, there is still a demon in his heart. This demon is the lover that he cooked and killed, the visiting professor of the West Hill Divine Palace after he betrayed the devil's doctrine, and you, in his eyes, are countless times more important than his own life. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 192. His Majesty decided that Ning Ke would lead the students of the academy to the wilderness for practice. When Master Yen Sei heard the news from his junior fellow apprentice, his wretched face suddenly became angry. His gray eyebrows kept moving up and down as if they were going to become a burning flame. He shouted, "What's going on?" Imperial advisor Li Qingshan smiled bitterly and said, "I also found it strange at the time. I thought about it carefully on the way out of the palace and roughly understood what His Majesty was thinking. Because of what happened to the Empress all those years ago, His Majesty's body has always had a hidden danger. No one knows when it will flare up, so he has to consider the future of the court." Master Yen Sei sneered and said, "The Tang Empire was founded by martial arts and ruled by law. Why do you need to worry about the affairs of the imperial court? Do you want to be like those places in the South Jin Kingdom who are in a hurry to get a minister?" Li Qingshan shook his head and said, "Our South School of Haotian Taoism looks impressive on the surface, but in fact, our peak combat power is small and weak. The powerhouses that can compete with the Divine Hall and maintain the strict laws of the people in the Empire ultimately have to rely on the Academy. Most of the little monsters on the second floor of the Academy are interested in the small Taoism and can't govern the country at all. The two at the top are people who don't care about the world. Fortunately, the Academy has Ning Ke now." "Ning Ke, what's wrong?" "Your Majesty, you've seen through this little guy very clearly. He's a worldly man with ambitions, desires, and ideas. And this is not a negative evaluation. Only those with ideas will be willing to enter the human realm. Once he enters the human realm, the Academy will not be able to completely stay out of it. After His Majesty enters the human realm, the imperial court will naturally be stable." After a moment of silence, Master Yen Sei sighed and said, "Any idea that looks too far ahead is actually too rigid. I understand what senior martial brother means." Ning Ke was indeed a nobody now, but everything needed to be prepared from the beginning. His Majesty appreciates him and is willing to nurture him. "Why are you so angry?" "He has just entered the Tao of Talismans, and he wants to get involved in such worldly affairs. In my opinion, this is purely causing trouble. How is this nurturing? If you want him to grow into a divine talisman master within 10 years, it's not advisable to pull up seedlings, and it's even more unadvisable to give him heavy responsibilities in advance. How dare the Lieutenant Palace of the Grassland go against the Empire?" When the Divine Hall issued the edict, it was mainly to guard against the desolate men who were returning to the south and the remaining members of the Devil's Doctrine who were hiding in the dark. Ning Ke and the disciples of the Academy will not encounter any real danger when they go there to practice. It is not a big deal, so there is nothing you need to worry about. Li Qingshan looked at his senior brother and gently persuaded, the cultivation of talisman Taoism pays particular attention to observing one's mind from the outside. In this case, even if he encounters some obstacles this time, it may be good for his cultivation. How can a piece of stubborn iron become fine steel without being hammered? If a piece of white paper can't even bear the force of the tip of a needle, how can it write a real talisman? The Academy had not yet received the letter written by His Majesty from the Daming Palace. The students of the Academy who were excitedly discussing that it would not be cold to practice in the south in autumn did not know that they were about to go to the cold and strange wilderness in a foreign country. Ning Ke did not even know that he was regarded as a key training target by the Empire and would soon take his former classmates to practice the same way. His whole mind was still on memorizing the talisman character and the research of talisman arrows. The wooden arrow shaft had been replaced by the material made of silver, fine steel and 2 other rare metals. Sixth brother had carefully made a tube of relatively light hollow steel arrow mixed with silver. He replaced the boxwood bow he was used to with the most repetitive bow in the military ministry's examination. With the help of Sang Sang, who fell on the bed and got up again and again, he finally wrote the talisman suitable for flying arrows. However, the following several experiments still failed. The relatively light metal arrow was still much heavier than the ordinary wooden arrow. When it left the bowstring, it flew everywhere and smashed into the ground. The pot and lid in the hands of seventh sister and Shin Pippi flew not far from the lake and then fell down, knocking a few fat and lazy fish unconscious. Ning Ke looked more and more disappointed. After many experiments, he roughly found the root of the failure. There was a problem with the coordination between shooting arrows with a hard bow and activating talisman. If the talisman on the arrow was activated when the arrow was pulled, the chi of heaven and earth would be disturbed and the turbulence in the wind would seriously affect the initial direction of the arrow. In the worst case, the arrow would not be able to be shot directly. However, if the talisman engraved on the arrow shaft was activated by psyche power after the arrow was released, it would fall into the predicament that Liu Qingshan had mentioned last year and fourth brother had just mentioned this year. The arrow was a long-range weapon that relied on an extremely fast speed, which could easily tear the psyche power connection between the cultivator and the arrow. In fact, I always feel that this problem should not have arisen. As long as I activate the talisman on the arrow when I shoot it out, then there would be no need for the psyche power connection. The arrow would naturally fly more and more steadily with the help of the chi of heaven and earth condensed by the talisman. But why did it fail now? Ning Ke, who looked a little haggard, sat on the threshold of the small warehouse next to the iron-making room and angrily talked to himself. These days, he had scratched his head and felt depressed so many times that his hair looked like a messy bird's nest. Seventh sister, sixth brother and Shin Pippi stood, looking at him with sympathy. The flying arrow experiment these days made the back of the mountain of the academy more lively and cheerful, and even attracted the 2 chess addicts to come down to watch twice. But seeing Ning Ke in so much pain, they could not help but feel a little anxious for him. But the research and development of talisman arrow itself is a field that no one has ever succeeded in, so no one can help. You also know what the problem is. When the arrow is shot out from the bowstring, the talisman on the shaft is activated. These 2 things must happen at the same time. If you can't solve this problem, no matter how good your idea is, it will be useless. Fourth brother stood at the door of the iron-making room and looked at them expressionlessly. Seventh sister and Shin Pippi looked at each other and saw the doubt in each other's eyes. Fourth brother, who was good at the practical field of talisman Taoism, had never shown the slightest interest in Ning Ke's experiment these days. He did not even bother to look at it, let alone express his opinion. In their view, fourth brother even seemed to have been waiting for their failure with cold eyes. Ning Ke stood up from the threshold and sincerely bowed to fourth brother. Then he explained, "This is indeed the problem, but I noticed it the day before yesterday and then improved it. Every time I experiment, I pay special attention to keep these 2 steps synchronized. So why can't it work? Whether it is before or after stimulation, as long as you need psyche power to stimulate it, it is impossible to maintain absolute synchronization. Because people's movements are too fast and can never be faster than psyche power. When you want to stimulate the talisman, you only need to think about it, and your fingers will always be a little slower. Ning Ke seriously said, I know this, so I have calculated the time of shooting arrows in advance. How much advance? How do you calculate it? By feeling? How do you know that your own psyche power does not affect the movement of your fingers? How do you know that your consciousness can be accurately divided into two parts? Fourth brother looked at him and reprimanded him in a low voice. You may be very talented in talisman Taoism, but you have forgotten the most important point. When talisman Taoism is used in practice, it is not something that can be achieved by feeling and imagination. It needs the most accurate and intuitive means of realization, which can't be solved by other means except technology. Ning Ke argued, but I have really kept accurate enough synchronization. Fourth brother looked at him coldly and said, what is accurate? What is synchronization? Synchronization is exactly the same. A minute, a second, a split second, and a split second were not synchronized. There were so many talisman Taoism masters in the previous generations, and no one is more stupid than you. Why can't they develop talisman arrows successfully? That's because they can't achieve complete synchronization. Hearing this severe reprimand, Ning Ke suddenly calmed down. Since he was praised as the successor of the divine talisman master by Master Yen Sei and gradually discovered his talent in talisman Taoism, he was inevitably a little proud and complacent in his heart, although he looked calm on the surface. So he always felt that he had used enough wisdom and efforts to solve the problem of talisman arrow, so he should solve it soon. Until fourth brother pointed out the most critical problem, he found that his mentality was indeed a little wrong, and he took it for granted. Looking at his thoughtful look, fourth brother's expression became a little better, and he slowly said, youngest brother, in fact, your design idea about talisman arrow is really excellent, and in my opinion, it is feasible. But you should be more calm and think more clearly about the most critical synchronization problem. Then I think maybe we can really witness a key breakthrough in the practical field of talisman Taoism. For this breakthrough, I hope you can continue to work hard. Ning Ke sincerely thanked him. Thank you for reminding me, fourth brother. The next morning, in the back mountain of the academy, Ning Ke, who obviously didn't sleep all night, appeared in front of the blacksmith room again. His face, which should have been more haggard, somehow looked 100 times more energetic. Only the messy bird's nest above his head became a more messy chicken coop, which proved how many times he scratched his head and pulled his hair last night. His voice slightly trembled, excited but not confident. Senior brother, you are right. There is no way to synchronize people's psyche with their body, so we have to give up the plan to stimulate it in the future. Then I thought, since psyche and body can't be synchronized, can we try to synchronize the movement of shooting arrows with the stimulation of talisman characters? That is to say, the forward stimulation ensures that the moment the archer shoots the arrow, the talisman on the shaft will be completed just because of the movement of shooting arrows. This has nothing to do with the archer's psyche, and it is completely the objective coordination between the movements. Fourth brother widened his eyes and asked, the movement of shooting arrows will stimulate the talisman characters by itself? This idea is really interesting, but how to do it? The forward stimulation means that once the talisman characters are written, they will be automatically stimulated. But how can you write the talisman when you shoot arrows? If you carve it on the battlefield, how can you guarantee the coordination with the movement of shooting arrows? We can't carve the talisman characters by ourselves. We must let the arrow carve the talisman characters. The talisman characters on the shaft will not be finished at the beginning, and only the last stroke is left. Then we will find a way to make the arrow automatically complete the last stroke in the process of shooting arrows. Ning Ke looked at fourth brother nervously, like a heretic who was being judged. What do you think of this idea? The last stroke of the talisman characters will be drawn by itself when the arrow leaves the string? Fourth brother stared at his eyes for a long time. Then he could not suppress the shock in his heart, and said in a slightly hoarse voice, youngest brother, you are really AF** king genius. I'm in such a terrible state that I have to put some pressure on myself. I'll guarantee 6,000 words tomorrow. Also, I sincerely hope that everyone can stimulate me so that I can quickly get out of this state. Although it's the new year in January and I can't fight for anything, it's important to have some stimulation when writing. Please continue to support me with your recommendation votes. Thank you very much. Since I had a break yesterday, I couldn't even see a shadow on the monthly votes list. If you have any votes, please vote 2 more. It's still a double period, so there will be twice the stimulation. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian to cast recommendation votes and monthly votes. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 193. Geniuses were often only associated with theories. They were only responsible for proposing possible solutions to problems, but were unwilling to verify the answers. They knew and guessed, but did not care about how to prove it. That was why Confucius, who was not good at mathematics, could propose the theory of relativity and then continue to be in a daze. The preliminary experimental verification needed to wait for several years before those poor scientists went to the wilderness and stared at the solar eclipse for a long time to make it. Ning Ke was praised as a genius. It seemed that he could throw his ideas to his senior brothers and let them turn them into reality. Unfortunately, the talisman arrow was what he needed, and the talisman was something that a talisman master had to participate in. More importantly, he was the youngest junior brother in the academy and had neither the qualification or the courage to pretend to be the leader of the subject. Therefore, in order to turn the genius idea into a perfect technological design, he had to continue painfully drawing drawings and talismans on paper in the following days, doing the most tedious and boring technological design work. As someone's natal item, Sang Sang had to continue to play an important role in the talisman experiment. After several ups and downs, it was finally the good time for her to be a little handmaiden of a rich family. However, she did not expect that she still had to struggle and roll around. Even though she was a little dull, she could not bear the itchiness and inexplicable strange feeling any longer. She resolutely tore off the white cloth on her body and moved the washtub to hide in the fake antique shop next door. Although he had lost the most sensitive experimental tool, Ning Ke still had to continue his research work. He stood in front of the desk and bit the tip of the pen, thinking hard about how to improve the talisman so that it could bring the greatest acceleration effect to the arrow. The most troublesome thing was how to perfectly draw the last stroke of the talisman when the arrow was ejected. His hair changed from a bird's nest to a chicken coop, and then to a fish house that second brother's big white goose built with seaweed in the stream. His eyes changed from tiredness to excitement and then to tiredness again and again until they were completely dark. He always felt that he was about to solve the problem, but he also felt that the answer was still floating in the clouds far away. He reached out to touch and explore, but there was always nothing. He bumped into the water's surface and the mirror, which was painful and annoying. At this moment, someone knocked on the door of the old brush pen shop. Ning Ke did not call Sang Sang. He called Sang Sang several times, but there was no response. Then he remembered that she had already hidden next door. He had to throw away the pen in his hand and walk forward to open the door angrily. A middle-aged man in a short-sleeved green shirt stood outside the door with a respectful expression. Ning Ke felt that the man looked familiar. He took the invitation and looked at the signature on the invitation. Then he remembered that this middle-aged man was the steward of the princess mansion. What is it? He rubbed his eyes, yawned, and asked, "Must I go?" The steward was startled by his reaction. He forced a smile and said, "Honorable Ning, I really don't know the specifics, but according to His Highness's arrangements, it should be a private gathering. It would be best if you went." Ning Ke was just asking casually. He did not mean to show that he was not afraid of the royal power. Ever since he stopped attending banquets in Chang and City, he had not participated in such social activities for several days. Now that he was busy with the talisman arrow, he should not be in the mood to attend such an appointment. However, Li Yu was the most beloved princess of the Tang Empire. He had not seen Li Yu for some time, so he wanted to see what she wanted to say and take a break. Perhaps it would be beneficial for the current predicament, so he said, "Be there on time tomorrow." The heat of the end of summer gradually faded. The big leaf fan in the distant corridor was still spinning, blowing a gentle breeze into the courtyard, adding to the refreshing and pleasant feeling. Sang Sang took Xiaoman to catch insects under the old trees. Ning Kei and Li Yu sat on the wooden planks in the courtyard, drinking tea and chatting. The scene was indescribably indifferent and casual. However, the expression on Ning Kei's face did not match his current appearance. He frowned very tightly, and the small dimple on his left cheek was especially clear because he was gritting his teeth and tightening his jaw muscles. He asked angrily, "Your Highness, can I not go? My father's letter should have arrived at the academy by now." Li Yu gently turned her wrist and brought the teacup to her lips. She took a sip and praised, "The rock tea from Shaanxi County is really good." Ning Kei looked at her beautiful face and sighed. He said, "Your Highness, can we skip these cliched pleasantries and get down to business? You and I are both young people. There is no need to learn from those old people and try to probe." Li Yu's thin eyebrows slowly raised as she listened to the words, and she looked at him with a faint smile. But in the end, she did not use these words to express her feelings. She said, "Since my father has spoken personally, I think Mr. Jun Mo will not object. In my opinion, you have to go to the wilderness. I have already entered the second floor. Why do I still have to go for practice?" Ning Kei asked confusedly. Li Yu also did not understand his attitude. She frowned and said, "Why are you not willing to go? You should know that the students of the academy will be the pillars of the imperial court in the future. If you lead them to practice in the wilderness, they will at least not dare to disrespect you on the surface, no matter whether they think of your benefits or not." Ning Kei shook his head and said, "The wilderness is a very dangerous place." Li Yu looked at his eyes quietly and said, "Will staying too long in the bustling Chang and wear down one's iron bones into a crisp? I don't believe such a small scene can scare you. I know your reputation as the woodcutter of Shubi Lake. Are you still afraid of those barbarians on the grassland?" "It's the woodcutter," Ning Kei corrected her. He continued to explain, "Although the 7 stockade villages have not officially fought with the Golden Palace in the grassland for many years, I am not unfamiliar with the battlefield. I am not afraid of returning to the battlefield. But since it is the battlefield, life and death have no eyes. Those students in the academy say that they are invincible, but they do terrible things. Who knows how many will die on the battlefield? I have to be responsible for their lives when I bring such a group of children to the battlefield. The pressure is too great." Li Yu smiled and said, "Don't forget that they were once your classmates. You keep saying that they are children. How much older can you be than them? I don't know why you have learned to act like an old man now." Ning Kei thought to himself that he was at least 7 or 8 years older than them. Although he was not old, he always looked at things cautiously. He said, "The older they are, the easier it is for them to survive on the battlefield in the wilderness. But in fact, you don't need to bear this kind of pressure." Li Yu looked at him and said calmly, "The practical cultivation of the academy is a major event for the empire to train talents. How can you protect them like an old hen? Life and death have no eyes. Only the students of the academy who can come back alive from the battlefield are qualified to be seriously trained by the imperial court. So you just need to bring them there and not care about their lives." Hearing this, Ning Kei was slightly shocked. After a moment of silence, he asked confusedly, "If I don't care about their lives on the battlefield, why do I have to bring them there? Can't the military ministry just send anyone?" Li Yu did not speak. She looked at the few freckles on this fresh and pleasant face and suddenly felt a faint sense of regret. Last year, when they returned from the grassland together, she could be said to be the first bigwig in the Tang Empire to discover Ning Kei's ability. She had also tried to recruit him, but now it seemed that compared to Ning Kei's potential, her efforts were indeed too weak. In just a year, this young soldier from the city of Wei had become the successor of the divine talisman master, a student of the second floor, and a celebrity in Chang'an. Her slender fingers slowly turned the teacup and gradually woke up from her daze. She looked at Ning Ke and said with a smile, "Father wants you to bring the students of the academy to the wilderness, not because he values those students, but because he values you. He wants you to win some face for the empire, and at the same time, he wants to see what kind of ability you can show." Ning Ke was slightly startled and said, "Your Majesty, don't you think too highly of me? Because you have ambition and ideas, different from those senior brothers and sisters in the back of the mountain of the academy. And father values your ambition and ideas. For our empire, whether young people have ambition or not is a very important thing. I really don't know what ambition I have. Or in another word, ideal? Your Highness should be clear about my ideals. They are all very simple things. But when you have fulfilled your childhood dreams, don't you have bigger dreams? For example?" Li Yu looked at his thoughtful expression and said, "Do you like to cultivate in the back of the mountain of the academy all year round?" Ning Ke answered without hesitation, "Yes." This question might have confused him in the past, but it was no longer a problem since Chin Pippi took him to the study in the cliff cave and saw the scholar who kept copying and reading. Li Yu stared at his eyes and asked, "But after you have enough power, don't you want to rely on power to do what you want to do and achieve some of the goals you want to achieve?" Ning Ke's mind flashed with the dilapidated mansion, the blood-stained stone lions, and his friends sitting in front of the wet wall. His body felt slightly stiff. After a long silence, he put these unspeakable thoughts behind him. He looked up at her and shrugged. He said casually, "I used to be obsessed with fame and fortune, but now I have it. I only know the troubles of being famous after I become famous. So I really don't know what to do in the future." Li Yu looked at him quietly and suddenly thought that this guy was now a student of the headmaster of the academy. The fame and fortune in the world were indeed not very attractive to him. Somehow, she felt a little frustrated and helpless. "I remember that once in the last winter, you told Xiaoman a fairy tale in the wooden courtyard where we are sitting now. The little princess in the fairy tale was proud, timid, and incompetent, while the frog prince was a bit unreasonable." After a long silence, she opened her mouth and said. As soon as she opened her mouth, she felt that something was wrong. She couldn't figure out why she suddenly told the story. But since it had already begun, she clenched her fists and forced herself to calm down and tell the story. She didn't know if it was because of the hot wind at the end of summer or because the palace maids in the corridor were lazy and stopped fanning themselves, but she felt that her cheeks were a little hot. If you want to do anything in the world, you must first dare to think. If you don't think, you will never be able to do it. The so-called ambition, desire, and ideal, in the final analysis, actually depends on the word courage. Li Yu's emotions gradually calmed down and she said slowly. It was quiet in the courtyard. Only the sound of the big leaf fans in the corridor in the distance could be faintly heard, the surprised cheers of Xiaoman under the old tree, and the sound of water dripping into the pond between the rockery could be heard. Ning Ke saw the tranquility, gentleness, and even indulgence in her eyes and understood the meaning of her words. He couldn't help but think of the young girl who listened to the story by the bonfire at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road. But in a flash, he came back to his senses and remembered that she was the noble princess of the Tang Empire. In particular, those past speculations were still lingering in his mind. After a moment of silence, he didn't answer, but asked, "How is Mr. Liu recently?" Li Yu didn't hear his tentative words, and felt a little regretful and sad. But she also breathed a sigh of relief. She picked up the precious bamboo pot in front of her and filled the teacup in front of Ning Quebec. She said with a smile, "Mr. Liu refused to live in Chang'an and insisted on cultivating in the tile-top mountain. A few days ago, he sent a letter saying that he was in good health. By the way, he was very happy to know that you entered the second floor of the academy." Thinking of the old man Liu Qingxin's selfless teachings on the journey, when he was just an unknown lad who couldn't cultivate, Ning Ke couldn't help but feel emotional and grateful, and his mood became much warmer. "Your Highness, when I go to the wilderness, I'll leave Sang Sang in your care. Don't worry. Under the care of the fourth princess of the Tang Empire, no one in Chang'an would dare to bully the little handmaiden. But Ning Kei's trip to the wilderness was the first time that Sang Sang left his side since she was born. So after getting such a positive answer, he was still a little worried. He stared into Li Yu's eyes and said very seriously, "Don't let anyone bully her." Being questioned by Ning Kei, Li Yu, as a princess, was not unhappy, but calmed down. Because she knew that Ning Kei was worried about Sang Sang, but he was willing to let her take care of Sang Sang, which showed a certain attitude. "Don't worry. If anyone dares to bully Sang Sang, I'll make him suffer." "Your Highness, that's too cruel. Just let that person die and his whole family die." "Your Highness?" "Nothing. I have a letter here. Take it with you. Although I know you won't be afraid of those barbarians in the wilderness, you are in a foreign land. If anything happens, take this letter to Crown Prince Chongming." Ning Kei took the letter and put it in his arms. When he was about to say some standard words of gratitude, he suddenly raised his eyebrows. Listening to the breathing coming from outside the flower wall, he wondered who in the princess's mansion dared to ignore the rules and eavesdrop on the conversation between the princess and him. Li Yu was slightly startled when she saw his expression. She looked back and frowned. "Why are you here? Have you finished today's homework? Since when does the Imperial College allow students to leave early?" A young man in bright yellow clothes came out from behind the flower wall. The young man had delicate features, but his face was pale as if he hadn't seen his eyes for a long time. His thin body and pale face gave people a feeling of weakness. The young man replied with a smile, "Sister, don't always be so fierce." Hearing the title, Ning Kei knew the identity of the young man. He was the eldest son of the emperor of the Tang Empire, the eldest Prince Li Huiyuan, who was most likely to inherit the throne. So he stood up and saluted with hands folded in front. When he saluted with hands folded in front, the young prince raised his eyebrows and showed a trace of displeasure on his pale face. He waved his hand casually and said, "No need." In his opinion, although this person was qualified to sit opposite his sister, he was not an ordinary person. But no matter who he was, since it was the first time he met the prince, he should at least bow to the ground, if not kneel. It was too disrespectful to bow so casually. He was secretly angry at Ning Kei for being disrespectful, but Li Yu's face suddenly turned cold. She scolded unhappily, "Where are the manners that the teacher usually taught you? Hurry up and return the greeting to Sir Ning." Hearing the words, Sir Ning, the young Prince Li Huiyuan suddenly remembered the uproar in the palace this year. He looked up at Ning Kei curiously and finally matched the real person with the person in the legend. If it was on a normal day, even if he knew that this person was someone appreciated by his father, he would not show any expression. But in the world, the person he feared the most was his sister. Looking at Li Yu's frosty face, he quickly stood up and returned the greeting to Ning Quebec. Ning Kei smiled gently and waved his hand to indicate that there was no need, but he did not move sideways to avoid it. Li Huiyuan noticed this from the corner of his eyes. When he stood up, his face was a little pale. But after all, he was a child who grew up in the royal family. He quickly suppressed the anger in his heart and walked in front of Ning Kei, holding his hand and chatting enthusiastically. His pale and immature face showed a morbid nobility. He deliberately showed affection, but could not hide the indifference in his eyes. Ning Kei was used to life and death, and could not tolerate such poor acting skills. But he was not unhappy because of this. Instead, he brought out his best acting skills and the best mental state. He was humble and enthusiastic, like a ball of fire in the desert in winter. Acting skills were the foundation of an actor's life. Today, Ning Kei and the young prince were performing on the same stage by the cool breeze and flowing water in the wooden courtyard. They kept performing like this, which was equivalent to using excellent acting skills to humiliate each other. Looking at the scene of the two chatting, Li Yu had already noticed that something was wrong. She rubbed her eyebrows in distress and stared at Ning Kei reproachfully, indicating that he should stop. The prince had suddenly appeared in the princess mansion and happened to meet him. Ning Ke would not believe that it was a coincidence. He knew what Li Yu meant, but he did not have the right and did not want to get involved in that matter. Even if he wanted to, it would be a long time in the future. So when he saw Li Yu's reproachful eyes, he smiled and stopped teasing the prince. He bowed to the two nobles and left. Under the willow tree on the way out of the princess mansion, he saw a young Taoist with a yellow paper umbrella under his arm. He could not help but be slightly startled. These days, he often went to the South School of Haotian Taoism across the imperial city, so he recognized the young Taoist as Mingqi, a disciple of the nation master Li Qingshan. This person was in charge of some important work in the imperial center administration and was extremely busy. He did not expect to see him in the princess mansion today. It seemed that he was waiting for someone. Ning Ke walked over and asked curiously, "Senior brother Mingqi, who are you waiting for?" The young Taoist looked at Ning Ke and smiled helplessly. He pointed to the direction of the mansion and said, "Under His Majesty's order, I am in charge of supervising the prince's study." He ran out of the directorate, so I had to follow him. Ning Ke thought that the foppish pale prince was really not an easy person to get along with. It was really a tough job to supervise his study. He looked at him sympathetically and comforted him, "It's just a matter of turning a blind eye." Fang Mingqi smiled bitterly and shook his head. He said, "I was adopted by my master. I have followed my master in and out of the palace since I was young. I am familiar with the prince, so His Majesty entrusted this task to me. I dare not take it lightly." Ning Ke went to the old tree to look for Sang Sang and chatted with Xiaoman for a while. Then he left the princess mansion. Walking in the busy streets and looking at the naughty children playing around the well, he thought of the young prince and the rumors about the fight for the throne. He could not help but shake his head and sigh. The princess is really unlucky to have such a brother. I don't know how much suffering she will suffer because of him in the future. Sang Sang asked curiously, "What's wrong with the prince?" "Young master, do you think he is an idiot again?" "If he is really an idiot, then it's fine. No one will make things difficult for him. But he has learned some tricks from Her Highness. An idiot who wants to be smart will easily cause trouble." Sang Sang looked around and reminded him in a low voice, "Young master, that is a prince." Ning Ke smiled and said, "So what? So what if he is Prince Long Qing? If this little prince dares to provoke me in the future, I will let him know how difficult it is to be a performer." "Young master, you are often very proud and complacent now. 2 years ago, we could only participate in the distribution of the gambling rights in the city of Wei. Now it seems that we can participate in the distribution of the throne. How can I not be proud? And it is not that there are no outsiders." Sang Sang glanced at him and did not speak. "You have to believe it. Once you enter the second floor of the academy, you will be the core disciple of the headmaster of the academy. As for the succession of the throne, the attitude of the academy seems to be very important now. The senior brothers and sisters in the back mountain are definitely not interested in this matter. I am probably the only one who might be interested." Ning Ke said, "That is why the princess played this trick today. But looking at the little prince's performance today, I suspect that she will regret today's arrangement. At least she should have told the little prince in advance." Sang Sang asked curiously, "The academy can also play a role in the succession of the throne?" "Young master, you have such a high status after becoming the core disciple of the headmaster of the academy? Is the headmaster of the academy so powerful?" Ning Ke said with a self-deprecating smile, "Don't forget that I have not seen this teacher until today. But I have heard a lot of rumors and the attitude of the people around me. I can roughly understand how important this teacher is. Young master, then should we be on the princess's side? Xiaoho should be on the empress's side. Then in the future, I can only stand on the other side of the empress, that is, on the princess's side. I mean, if there is a need to choose a side. In fact, I have figured this out a long time ago. But everything is waiting for a good price. If I want to sell it at a suitable price, I have to wait. Now that the price is good, I can slowly start selling it." Sang Sang suddenly stopped and looked up at his side profile. She said very seriously, when you were telling me the fairy tale about the frog prince, I also understood it. Is this a good price? After a moment of silence, Ning Ke shook his head and said, not all toads want to eat swan meat. Is swan meat not delicious? Sang Sang asked confusedly. Ning Ke looked at her and said with a smile, in the eyes of some toads, dirty and smelly black loach is much more delicious than swan meat. Sang Sang asked, young master, are you beating around the bush and saying that I am ugly and black? Ning Ke smiled and said, it seems that my little girl is finally willing to use her brain to think. Sang Sang said seriously, so the more I think about it, the more I think it is a good thing. According to what you told me when I was a child, if I can marry Her Highness, I can work less for many years. Ning Ke continued to walk forward and said, the problem is how many people she has said this to. These words involved the most vicious speculation about women. Sang Sang frowned and said unhappily, young master, you have always been prejudiced against Her Highness. In fact, she is a good person. Whether she is a good person or a bad person, what does it have to do with me? Didn't you say just now that you want to sell it at a good price? What price will be higher than Her Highness's? Hey, haven't you heard that selling one's art is not selling one's body? I have tried my best to write and continue to pressure myself. Tomorrow, I will still keep writing 6,000 words. Please continue to sincerely vote for me and vote for me. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for me and vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 194. Behind the famous first-grade restaurant in the western city of Chang'an, there was an inconspicuous tea shop. Two people were sitting behind a bamboo mat in the depths of the tea shop. The short and fat middle-aged man kept wiping the sweat off his forehead. It seemed that the stuffy heat of the end of summer had greatly affected him. Even his Hebei accent sounded a little dry. You are a secret guard. You have to do what you have to do. What's wrong with helping out with the mission in the wilderness this time? I just want you to take a look, not investigate a case. The short and fat middle-aged man was the deputy commander of the Imperial Bodyguard, Su Chongshan. He had specially left the palace today to meet Ning Ke, who was sitting opposite him, took out a handkerchief from his sleeve and began to wipe his sweat like him. However, it was obvious that his sweat was not because of the hot and sultry weather, but because of what the other party had said. General Xiahou. What kind of person is he? How do you want me to look at him? To see how many strands of beard he has or how many times he goes to the toilet every day? Mr. Su, I know this is His Majesty's intention. But you have to think about it. With General Xiahou's temper, if he finds out that I am secretly spying on him, he will definitely get angry and find a place where no one is around to smash me into meat paste. Then, he will wrap me into a bun and feed me to the horses. Who will stand up for me then? If General Xiahou really can't leave any evidence, neither the palace nor the academy can stand up for you according to the law of the Tang Empire. If you can leave some evidence before you die, then it's okay. You know I am joking. Ning Ke put down the handkerchief and looked at Commander Luo, who was smiling awkwardly. He thought that this joke was not funny. It was very likely that he would meet Xiahou in the wilderness. If there was a chance, he would certainly want to investigate him. However, this matter was too dangerous. He did not expect to receive this request at this time. It seemed that His Majesty was still worried about Xiahou. So what role could he play in this process? Seeing his silence, Commander Su thought that he was still conflicted. He comfortingly said, "Don't worry too much. The Emperor's meaning is very simple. You only need to watch General Xiahou's actions and reactions. After you return to the capital, tell the Emperor the details you see. There is no need to take any risks. His Majesty likes you, and you are a student of the headmaster of the academy. Although General Xiahou is ruthless and cruel, he is not like those wild boars in the mountains. He is not stupid and will not offend you for no reason. Ning Ke wondered what he would do if he offended Xiaoho. Is there a problem? Su Chongshan picked up his handkerchief and wiped his sweat again. He looked at Ning Ke with hope and said, if there is no problem, I will go to the palace now. If there is anything in Cheng and that you are worried about, tell me and I will handle it. Ning Ke said, you know I have a shop on Lin 47th Street. Su Chongshan patted his chest hard and said in a heroic manner, I'll watch over you. Ning Ke shook his head and said with a smile, I have a little handmaiden, and I want to ask the bodyguard office to take care of her for me. If the Emperor of Tang sent a bodyguard to watch over the general's words and actions, it would definitely cause a political turmoil. Therefore, in order to keep it a secret, His Majesty did not summon Ning Ke to the palace. Instead, he asked Su Chongshan to find a secret place outside the palace and secretly pass on the secret edict. After receiving the secret edict, Ning Ke should have sealed it in the deepest part of his heart and not tell anyone. However, there had never been any secrets between him and Sang Sang. Therefore, when he returned to Lin 47th Street, Sang Sang, who was preparing to cook, immediately knew the specific content of the secret edict. She looked at Ning Ke who was standing by the window and asked, will it be dangerous? Ning Ke picked up his brush and looked at her through the window. He said, the main thing is to observe his expression and then ask around. Su Chongshan is right. There is no danger at all. If there is, I will not do it. Sang Sang lowered her head and continued to wash the rice. She asked, so you agreed? Ning Ke lowered his head and continued to draw talismans. He said, as the golden secret agent of His Majesty and the focus of the younger generation of the Tang Empire, if the Empire uses me, I will definitely win. Well, not necessarily win. I have to admit that my life can never be smooth for too long. You should know the reason why I did not refuse. There was a chance to get close to Xiaoho and observe him with the secret edict of His Majesty. He might even find a chance to take revenge. For Ning Ke, who had waited for 14 years, it was a chance that he could not miss. Sang Sang did not say anything. She rubbed the rice hard in the basin with her little hands. The clear water gradually turned into something like rice milk. No one knew how many layers of rice had been rubbed off by her. Her figure became thinner and dimmer. If you wash the rice a few more times, will you still be able to steam it? Ning Ke put the brush pen on the inkstone and looked at the scene outside the window. After a moment of silence, he said, don't worry. My current level is not even comparable to Xiaoho's finger. Naturally, I won't be so idiotic as to take revenge immediately. Sang Sang stood up and wiped her hands on her apron. She looked back at him behind the window and said, young master, since you can't take me there, you must hold back when you see Xiaoho. Did I hold back when I saw Princely Pei Yan during the academy entrance exam last year? Ning Ke shook his head and said, we are hunters who grew up in Min Mountain. Our patience when dealing with prey is our most powerful weapon. What kind of luggage do I need to prepare? The same 3 things. Ning Ke was about to take the students of the academy to the frontier fortress wilderness. He might see Xiaoho. Ning Ke was a little excited, but he was more nervous. Thinking of the possible dangers, he was more anxious to develop the talisman arrow. After dinner that day, Sang Sang rolled up her trouser legs and sat by the well to cut feathers and polish the tuft for him. Meanwhile, he concentrated on the white paper on the desk and kept drawing complicated talisman lines. Not all parts of the wilderness were desolate. Before the fierce winter wind arrived, most of the ground was covered with carpet-like grass. But when it was the end of summer in the central plains, the wilderness would feel the slight chill of autumn in advance. The grass would begin to be stained with frost, turning yellow and white, giving off a somewhat somber feeling. The horse's hooves trampled a frost grass that was taller than its companion into the mud. Accompanied by a slight neigh and heavy breathing, more and more warhorses appeared on the meadow. The elite cavalry of the left king's palace escorted the tribes southward. In a place further south, more than 1,000 grassland cavalrymen waved their machetes and shouted in a strange voice. They broke through the frontier fortress of northern Yan Kingdom and instantly occupied a traveling village, surrounding a caravan. Blood began to spray along the gaps made by the machetes. The summer grain harvested by the village began to flow along the gaps made by the machetes. Precious tea leaves and salt bags began to fall along the gaps made by the machetes. The villagers and caravan guards of the Yan Kingdom screamed and fell into a pool of blood. Their bodies fell heavily to the ground, just like those heavy bags of grain and caravan goods. They instantly lost their lives. The grassland cavalrymen shouted excitedly. After killing everyone, they began to clumsily reharness the carts. They moved all the grain and goods they could find onto the carts and then returned to the north. Summer had ended and autumn had arrived. Winter was not far away. The left King's Palace tribe, which had lost the fertile grassland in the north, could not raise too many cattle and sheep. If they did not seize the time to grab enough grain before the arrival of the first snow, the tribe was very likely to face a disaster. As for the villages they had massacred and the caravans, it was not a problem that the grassland barbarians needed to consider. In fact, the people in the wilderness were very clear about the importance of the caravan. However, now they were facing the panic in front of them. Even the wisest military counselor of the palace would not force them to think about long-term problems. The frontier fortresses in the north of Yan Kingdom were broken through by the grassland barbarian cavalrymen. Countless caravans were plundered and countless villages' grain was stolen. The news was quickly spread by the wind in the wilderness to all parts of the Yan Kingdom and then gathered in the palace. Crown Prince Chongming, who had just returned to the country, calmly put on his armor under the indifferent gaze of his father who was lying on the sickbed. He led 3,000 guards to the northern border. The city gate was opened and the ceremonial music was played. However, the people of the Yan Kingdom who were watching the show did not show much excitement on their faces. They looked at the Crown Prince's carriage with extremely cold eyes. The left King's Palace in the wilderness was unable to restrain all the tribes. The barbarian cavalrymen had gone crazy. The frontier fortress troops of the Yan Kingdom and the thousands of guards who only knew how to eat, drink and have fun could not stop the grassland cavalrymen who rode like the wind and shot like gods. Fortunately, the West Hill Divine Palace had issued an edict. All the countries in the Central Plains would come to support them. The abominable and terrible Tang Empire would also send their cavalry. For the Yan Kingdom's emperor and people, this was a humiliating and helpless choice. This was capital Cheng, the capital of a weak country. At the back of the mountain of the academy, the morning light was shining and the mountain fog was gradually dispersing. Fourth brother and sixth brother sat cross-legged beside the water wheel. After meditating and regulating their qi circulation, they looked at each other and began to repeat the discussion process that they had repeated for several days. There was a magical sand table between the two of them. The complicated lines of Fu characters on the sand table moved forward slowly and then formed various possibilities. In the blacksmith's room, which was very close to the stream, the steam was getting thicker as the water wheel was pouring water into it. In the burning furnace, some silver iron-like metals were slowly softening and melting. Seventh sister, who had just woken up, stood at the upstream of the stream and looked at the silent and worried expressions on their faces. After a moment of silence, she threw the wet towel in her hand on a stone and turned to walk to the waterfall in the distance. There was a mountain about 70 miles away from the capital of the South Jin Kingdom. This mountain was not as majestic and towering as the mountain behind the academy in the southern suburbs of Chang'an. Most of its body was covered by clouds and mist all day long. Instead, it was calmly exposed under the clear sunlight. Every crack in the cliff and every rock was so clear. The overall shape of the mountain was also very clear. The cliffs on three sides were relatively smooth and reflected the light from the sky. They shone brightly and then gathered at the peak, looking like a sword. The sect of Lu Bai, the sage of sword, the strongest in the world, was at the foot of the mountain. It was an old-style ancient pavilion with distinct black and white colors. Dozens of young cultivators knelt on the ground and bowed respectfully to the ancient pavilion. Behind them was a sword tightly bound by straw ropes. Different from the flying swords of ordinary sword masters, these swords were relatively longer and larger, more like the swords used by warriors. Moreover, they were hidden quietly in their sheaths. The young swordsman respectfully knelt on the ground. The ancient pavilion was silent. After an unknown period of time, a calm yet sharp voice like a sword rang out. This voice was so sharp that it seemed to be able to pierce through the firm cliffs behind the sword pavilion. It seemed to be able to pierce through any tangible things in the world. Disgraced people, don't come back. Hearing this voice, the dozens of young swordsmen who knelt on the ground looked slightly stiff. They seemed extremely nervous and excited. After responding loudly, they got up and walked out. Dozens of fine horses were waiting, neighing slightly. The young people rode their horses and left the sect, heading north. This was the sword pavilion, a place under the care of the strong. The turbid waves of the surging yellow river rolled. For a moment, no one knew how many waves were produced. The ferrymen on the riverbank held bamboo poles and knelt respectfully on both sides of the wooden road. Back then, Lu Bai, the sage of sword, had comprehended the surging sword will beside this yellow river. Today, the young cultivators of the great river kingdom would cross this yellow river and head north. Under the white tower by the sea, a woman with a face full of wrinkles, wearing a strange dress made of countless pieces of cloth, looked indifferently at the juniors in front of her. She said in a hoarse and strange voice, "If you want to go to the north of Yan Kingdom, you need to pass through the Tang Empire. The imperial court has already issued a document. You can go now. I believe the Tangs will not make things difficult for you." A young sadhu looked at the woman in surprise and asked, "Master Kuni, won't you go with us?" A vicious and hateful look flashed in the old woman's eyes. She snapped, "The Tang Empire is a sinful place where etiquette is corrupt and there is no faith. Even a speck of dust from it will make me feel disgusted." This sister of the Yueluan kingdom had been cultivating Buddhism since she was a child. She had a profound cultivation state and a high status in the Buddhism sect. These young cultivators who were going to the north of Yan Kingdom under the West Hills Edict could be said to be her disciples and grand-disciples. She looked at the juniors who were waiting for her orders and said coldly and proudly, "I will go from the north and directly pass through Min Mountain. I want to see if anyone in the Tang Empire will stop me." This was the Yueluan kingdom, a place where the light of Buddha shone. The horses' hooves trampled on the fertile land, as if oil could be squeezed out. Hundreds of knights solemnly advanced under the warm sunlight. They wore pure black armors that were painted with complicated golden patterns. The surface of the black armors and the golden patterns flickered under the bright sunlight, giving off a solemn sense of beauty and pressure. Thousands of devout believers of the Haotian sect were about to kneel down to worship the mountain. When they heard the thundering hooves, they were so shocked that they hid under the trees by the roadside. When they saw the faces of the knights, they hurriedly knelt down and kowtowed, full of surprise and awe. The West Hill Papal Sacred Cavalry was known as the most elite cavalry in the world. The devout believers who kowtowed by the roadside felt that it was a blessing from their ancestors when they saw one of them. Today, they saw hundreds of sacred cavalrymen. They could not help but be overjoyed. Some women even fainted from excitement and they saw the solemn expressions of the sacred cavalrymen. Some well-informed believers could roughly guess the reason why the papal divine army was dispatched. But they still did not understand why the divine hall would pay so much attention to the chaos caused by the grassland barbarians. Among the hundreds of papal sacred cavalrymen, there were several priests of Haotian Taoism in red robes. The young general of the papal sacred cavalrymen was so handsome that he seemed extraordinary. He walked under the sun, and his armor seemed to be plated with a layer of Haotian divine light. He was perfect and inviolable like the Son of God. This was the West Hill, a place favored by Haotian. The back hill of the academy was shrouded in the deep night. Ning Ke put the talisman drawing on the table and sat down tiredly in the corner. He watched the flickering fire for a while and fell asleep unknowingly. He was really exhausted these days, and his brain was also exhausted to the extreme. He actually came up with a solution in such a short time. That day I praised youngest brother as a genius in talisman Taoism. He really did not let me down. Fourth brother looked at the lines on the paper and then glanced at Ning Ke, who was sleeping in the corner. He said, "I don't know what gave him such a strong motivation." Sixth brother said in a low voice while calculating the metal ratio needed for the talisman arrow, "I can feel that youngest brother is very anxious, as if he is worried about something. I don't know if it is about going to the wilderness." Fourth brother said, "The wilderness. The West Hill Divine Palace is worried about the revival of the Devil's Doctrine. Youngest brother is after all a member of the academy. What is there to worry about? Didn't youngest uncle kill the remnants of the Devil's Doctrine badly enough?" Sixth senior brother asked honestly, "Senior brother, I don't quite understand the logic of this sentence. Youngest martial uncle killed the people of Devil's Doctrine in the past. If youngest brother meets people of Devil's Doctrine again, shouldn't he be more worried?" Fourth brother looked at him and asked, "Do you think the minister of the Ministry of Rights of the Empire will not worry about being killed by the Yans when he goes to the Kingdom of Yen?" Sixth brother raised his head and thought for a moment. He said, "Of course not. If the minister of the Ministry of Rights visits capital Cheng, I'm afraid that the Kingdom of Yen will be destroyed. It's the same simple logic." Fourth brother said calmly, "If the people of the Devil's Doctrine dare to hurt youngest brother, won't the Devil's Doctrine be afraid of being destroyed? Won't they be afraid of being slaughtered by youngest uncle again? But youngest uncle is dead. Youngest uncle is dead, but master is not. Moreover, second brother has always wanted to learn from youngest uncle. Then what is youngest brother worried about?" Fourth brother looked at Ning Ke, who was still frowning in sleep. After a moment of silence, he said, "I don't know. But he is youngest brother. As his senior brothers, of course we have to find a way to make him not afraid." "What way?" "First, fix the talisman arrow for him." "Oh." At the end of the conversation, the heavy sound of hammering iron rang in the room. Sixth brother's movement was so fast that it was like a residual shadow. The sound of hammering iron stretched out, like a never-ending thunder. However, even such a loud sound could not wake up Ning Ke, who was extremely tired. The fourth brother held the sand table and kept simulating the talismans designed by Ning Quebec. He referred to the marginal notes written by Ning Ke on the paper and tried to match all kinds of talisman lines. He even tried to recombine these lines with tactical arrays. The talisman arrows were made of special materials. Although the sixth brother's ingenious hollow tube design reduced a lot of weight, it was still much heavier than ordinary arrows. Therefore, ordinary hardwood bows could not be used. Before making the talisman arrows, the first thing they had to do was to make the special bows. As the sound of hammering iron continued and the sizzling sound of molten iron pouring into the clay mold continued, the strange hard bow composed of mixed fine steel strips gradually took shape. Under sixth brother's careful consideration, the most important part began to glow with a faint luster. Fourth brother had completely mastered the design of Ning Ke's talisman lines. He walked over to guide the design of that part. Seeing sixth brother's seemingly clumsy fingers holding the silver tray like embroidery, he frowned slightly and asked, "What carving knife are you going to use?" "The material of the talisman arrow is extremely hard, and it needs to be very precise. Ordinary carving knives are completely useless." Sixth brother chuckled and took out a small box from his arms. From the box, he took out a transparent stone grain which was 2/3 wrapped by a secret metal sheet. He said, "Use extremely hard mixed silver as the tray, and use diamond as the carving knife. The diamond's resistance is not good. So I wrapped it with a layer of iron sheet. Of course, it's not an ordinary iron sheet. It's a special kind of steel left, and we made the armor for General Xiaohe with Professor Huang last time. How's the sharpness?" "I've sharpened it for 3 days. The cutting surface is excellent. Look." Sixth brother raised the diamond and pointed it at the blazing fire. The bright yellow flame spread through the complex surface and turned into countless beautiful lights, just like the stars in the night sky. Next, the two men, who were used to silence and decided not to make youngest brother afraid, began the most difficult part of the work, which was to build the body of the talisman arrow. It was also in this part that they encountered an unsolvable problem. The proportion of 4 metals is not a problem. The key is that there are too many impurities in it. I've chosen the best material from the military ministry, but the material itself has impurities. It's difficult to purify them with the current temperature of the fire. Looking at the burning molten iron, sixth brother scratched his head and said helplessly, "I've never tried this method before. The temperature needed to forcibly fuse these 4 metals is too high. I don't know how to do it." Just then, the door of the smithing room was pushed open. Seventh sister walked in and looked at Ning Kei, who was sleeping in the corner, with a smile. She turned to them and said, "I've brought 2 helpers. I don't know if you need them." Fourth brother looked at the 2 people behind her and slightly bowed with hands folded in front. Then he seemed to think of something and smiled at Ning Kei, who was sleeping soundly. He said, "I finally understand why those talisman masters failed to make the talisman arrow. 2 grand cultivators in the knowing destiny state are blacksmiths. Who else can have such treatment except youngest brother?" Second brother walked over expressionlessly and grabbed the heavy iron hammer. Chin Pippi walked over with a smile. He stood in front of the fire and slowly closed his eyes. The fire in the furnace suddenly became extremely bright, and then quickly turned into a faint blue. Second brother held the ancient crown on his head and smashed the burning red metal with one hand with the hammer. A loud bang resounded. The hammer fell on the anvil and the strong chi shot out like electricity. Except for Chin Pippi, the rest of the people in the room were all shaken and fell to the ground. The huge crash was like a muffled thunder, resounding through the whole valley of the back mountain of the academy. Ripples appeared in the clear stream. The fish swam restlessly. The girl copying the hairpin-style small regular script in the old library looked up at the east window and remained silent. 2 chess addicts hugged a pine tree. 2 tone addicts held the flute and zither tightly in their arms. The flower addict protected the flowers in front of her. The calligraphy addict was still copying books with her head down. This was the academy, the unique academy in the world. Still asking for all kinds of tickets enthusiastically, just like the brothers in the academy. I would like to report to everyone that our deputy moderator, Hiro, will not be able to leave for a period of time due to academic reasons and changes in his life. I salute him and thank him for the help he has given me and the book review section in the past few months. The first Back Mountain Cup book review competition is about to begin. Please go to the book review section for details. I will write a single chapter in a few days. Also, tomorrow is the end of the first volume of Back Night. No matter how many words I write, I will write until the end. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidien.com to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 195. In the corner, Ning Kei was awakened by the thunder-like sound of the hammer, and then he was knocked out again by the violent sound of the hammer. In the dreamlike world, he vaguely heard vague sounds of thunder and rain, and soft laughter. After a long time, he woke up rubbing his eyes and found that he was still leaning against the wall of the smithy. The fire in the stove not far away was suppressed by the mud, and the room was no longer hot. There was no one in the room. Rubbing his sore shoulders, he stood up by holding the wall and walked to the window. He was slightly surprised to find a box made of paulownia wood on the table. He remembered that there was no such thing on the table yesterday. The paulownia wood box was rectangular, about the length of an arm. Opening the box, he could see 6 or 7 strangely shaped metal objects lying quietly at the bottom of the box. The surface of these metal objects was dark, and if he looked carefully, he would find that there were countless fine seams on the seemingly uniform surface, which were actually made of countless extremely fine metal wires. Looking at them with the naked eye, he could feel the great tenacity hidden in them. Ning Kei's fingers slowly stroked the surface of the dark objects in the box, feeling the rough touch from his fingertips and the inexplicable toughness. He could not help but slightly raise his eyebrows. The shape of these dark metal objects was very strange, and he did not know their specific use, especially the metal piece about the size of 3 fingers in the top small compartment of the box, which was not heavy enough even to smash people. Moreover, there was a tiny silver tray inlaid on the metal piece, in which there was a bright diamond with only the top tip exposed. It did not look like a weapon at all, but more like, "Isn't this a wedding ring?" Ning Kei murmured to himself, but his bright eyes were full of joy. He had already figured out what the dark metal parts in the box were used for. Relying on his absolute familiarity with bows and arrows and his dexterous hands, he began to assemble them without anyone's guidance. The slight sound of metal wedge buckling could be heard continuously. After a very short time, a dark metal bow appeared in his hand. Then he tightly grasped the bow made of countless fine metal wires in his left hand, and with his right hand, he took out the special double-twisted 8-strand string from the box and began to string it. The dark longbow was gently placed on the table, and then his eyes fell on the dark quiver beside the box. He took a deep breath and slowly pulled out an arrow from the quiver. This was a long arrow made of alloy, and the shaft was designed to be extremely slender. Although it was made of hollow tubes, it was still extremely heavy in his hand. Ning Kei forcibly suppressed his excitement, and held the long metal arrow with both hands. His left hand slowly moved from the end of the arrow to the arrowhead, and carefully felt the subtle touch on the surface of the shaft. He felt it very carefully, and felt the unbreakable toughness of the shaft itself. He also looked very carefully, and with the morning light shining through the window, he saw the fine lines on the shaft that looked like scales. He did not know how many times it took to forge the arrow, how many tens of thousands of layers it was pounded together, and how many layers it was layered on top of each other. At the center of the arrow shaft's own scale-like fine lines, there were even more clear and deep lines, combining together in an extremely calm manner. Only, at the very bottom was an expanse of emptiness, always giving one a type of feeling that there was a line missing here. If this emptiness could be filled up, these lines would immediately become lively and lively. Ning Kei walked out of the iron forging room with the heavy bow and arrow in his hand. Facing the beautiful morning light from the east of the cliff plateau, he took a deep breath and became more refreshed. A faint snoring sound came from the grass between the house and the mirror lake. He looked around and found senior brothers lying under the tree by the lake, with a few wine pots scattered around them. Chen Pippi slept the most, with saliva dripping from the corner of his mouth from time to time. Seventh sister leaned against the ancient tree with her eyes closed, with a wine pot hooked in her little finger, shaking it up and down from time to time, as if she was fishing. On the other side of the tree, second brother, who was always meticulous in his clothes and etiquette, had long been crooked with the ancient crown on his head that always stood upright like a club. Ning Kei silently looked at the sleeping senior brothers and sisters outside the house, and guessed that they had been busy all night for him last night. His chest gradually became very warm, but he did not know what to say. Second brother opened his eyes and woke up. He stood up and straightened the ancient crown on his head, motioning for Ning Kei to follow him to the lake, so as not to disturb those guys who were tired and drunk. Standing by the lake, facing the wind and the morning dew, second brother said seriously after a moment of silence, "Don't ruin the reputation of the academy when you go to the wilderness. Even if the academy won't ruin its 1,000-year reputation because of you, youngest brother, you are now a famous person in the Tang Empire. Don't ruin your reputation." Ning Kei said with a smile, "I'm not a famous person. It's just a name." Second brother glanced at him and said with appreciation, "Indifferent to fame and fortune, you can see the nothingness in the fame." Youngest brother, you said it well. If I heard it, I would definitely regard you as a bosom friend. The senior brother he mentioned was naturally the eldest brother of the academy. Ning Kei was slightly stunned and could not help but feel a little ashamed. Second brother, thank you for your hard work last night. I thought I might need to ask Professor Huang He for help. I don't know much about talisman Taoism, but your master Yen Sei is already the top figure in the world. If he can't help you develop talisman arrows, it's meaningless for you to ask Professor Huang. Speaking of which, I still don't know where the professors of the academy live. The professors are all visiting professors. There are many foreigners, and most of the time they live in seclusion in the mountains. Why have I never met them in the mountains? At this time, second brother said some nonsense, because the mountain is a very big mountain. Then he looked back at the dark bow and arrow on Ning Kei's body and asked, "Do you want to have a try?" Ning Kei nodded. The senior brothers and sisters who were sleeping in the bushes under the tree woke up. The senior brothers who were hugging pine trees and flowers in other parts of the mountain also came out. Even the third sister, Yu Lian, who rarely appeared in front of others, came to the lakeside. 11 people surrounded Ning Quebec. Some were waiting nervously, some were talking excitedly, and some were scratching their heads to express that it was really not interesting. The reason why they came to see youngest brother try his archery was purely because they fainted from the noise last night. Ning Kei gently put the dark and slender talisman arrow on the iron bow, took a deep breath and raised it high, aiming at the high sky, as if he wanted to shoot down the sun that was actually still under the cliff platform. With a slight squeak, the seemingly unshakable iron bow slightly deformed, and the tight bowstring was pulled backward, deeply sinking into the 3 fingers of his right hand. Because this test was of great significance, for the sake of safety, he chose to control the bowstring with 3 fingers that he didn't use very often. With his action, the discussion by the lake stopped abruptly, and it suddenly became extremely quiet. The senior brothers and sisters on the second floor of the academy nervously or curiously looked at his fingers that tightly pulled the bowstring. In the clear lake like a mirror, the fish that got up early to look for food slowly swam. Across the lake, the proud big white goose was rinsing its chest and abdomen with water. As the muscles of Ning Kei's forearm and his sleeves loosened, the tight bowstring rubbed against his fingertips at a high speed, driving the dark and slender metal arrow to suddenly shoot forward at a speed invisible to the naked eye. The sharp arrowhead instantly protruded forward from the archer's grip. When it traveled a certain distance, the diamond embedded in the archer's grip slightly rubbed against the metal arrow shaft. The diamond tip, which had an extremely complicated profile, casually drew a line on the arrow shaft like a brush tip dipped in ink on a piece of paper. It was the blank of the talisman on the arrow shaft, and it was the last stroke of that talisman. The tail of the arrow finally left the bowstring. No one knew whether it was because the speed was too fast, or because the talisman on the arrow was stimulated, but when the tail of the arrow left the bow, it actually brought a mass of milky turbulence. Then, the talisman arrow instantly disappeared. No one on the lakeside could clearly see the trajectory of the arrow and where it flew in the air. Only second brother, who looked up at the sky, slightly squinted his eyes. Until then, a gust of wind blew, making Ning Kei's clothes, who was still holding the bow, flutter. People on the lakeside felt a slight chill, and Ning Kei's left hand, which was holding the bowstring tightly, suddenly had a lot of dew. The fish in the lake were still swimming slowly. The big white goose on the other side finished washing and began to bend its neck to sing to the sky. A moment later, the senior brothers and sisters, who were still staring at the sky and trying to find the trace of the talisman arrow, saw a hole in the middle of the white cloud high up in the sky. Through the hole, they could see the azure sky even higher up. Fourth brother said in a slightly trembling voice, "Was it shot out?" Sixth brother guessed in a slightly hoarse voice, "It should be shot out." Seventh sister said in surprise, "Was it really shot out by this arrow?" Second brother said indifferently, "Yes, it was shot out." Everyone on the lakeside suddenly changed their expressions. They looked at the hole in the cloud high up in the sky and exclaimed in joy. Senior sister Yu Lian also slowly raised her eyebrows, with a trace of a smile on her face. It seemed that even she did not expect that the talisman arrow could fly so high and have such great power. At this time, Chen Pippi asked a very important question. He rubbed his chubby face and looked up at the blue sky and white clouds with difficulty, asking in confusion, "Where did the arrow go?" This question was indeed very important, but at this moment, people from the academy who had witnessed the birth of the first real talisman arrow in the history did not care about this key question at all. Ninth brother praised, "How can there be no joy in such a good thing?" 10th brother nodded repeatedly and stroked the string of the zither with his fingers, saying, "An arrow can't be shot without a string." 6th brother lifted the heavy iron hammer under his feet and said in a simple and honest manner, "Second brother used my hammer to forge the iron." 7th sister pinched the embroidery needle between her fingers and said with a smile, "I also helped a little." 9th brother put the flute to his lips and played cheerful music. When everyone was ready to play in harmony like that night on the top of the cliff, they suddenly heard an extremely shrill whistle in the sky above their heads. It instantly suppressed the sound of the flute by the lake, as if there was an immortal playing the flute above the clouds. Although people on the second floor of the academy were crazy, they were definitely the smartest people in the world. Hearing the shrill whistle, they instantly guessed the reason. Their faces suddenly turned slightly pale and they instantly ran away from Ning Ke with the fastest speed imaginable. They scattered like birds and beasts, each looking for a safe shelter. Ning Ke did not know what was about to happen, but he still could not suppress his excitement. He looked at the sky above his head in a daze and did not even dare to blink his eyes. Second brother and Shin Pippi stood on both sides of him, looking up at the sky with different expressions. The shrill whistle instantly passed from the distant sky to the lakeside. The little black dot just entered Ning Ke's eyes, and the next moment it turned into a metal arrow that tore the air at a high speed and stabbed at his head. Second brother gently waved his sleeves, which flew like a flag in a frontier fortress and rolled up the black shadow that was about to fall on the ground. He skillfully pulled, carried and released the metal talisman arrow with horrible speed and power, and changed its direction. With a soft sound, a small tear appeared on his sleeves. With a loud bang, half of the pavilion in the center of the mirror lake collapsed. Ning Ke's face turned pale, and then he reacted. Looking at the lake full of smoke and dust, he murmured, F***ck, seventh sister ran over with a pot lid on her head. Looking at the half-collapsed pavilion, she murmured with a pale face, F***ck, second brother frowned and glanced at her unhappily. People gathered at the lakeside again, pointing at the collapsed pavilion and talking excitedly. Fourth brother looked at the dissipating smoke and dust on the lake, with a satisfied smile as if his long-cherished wish had been fulfilled. He walked along the wooden bridge and came back with the talisman arrow and a small box in his hand. Drawing the last stroke of the talisman with diamond, youngest brother, your idea is really genius. But it is a pity that a talisman arrow can only be shot once and cannot be reused. Last night, sixth brother and I made a set of repair tools, but we haven't tried it yet. If you need to repair in the wilderness, you can try it. He handed the small box to Ning Ke and seriously reminded him, talisman arrows are made of rare materials and are extremely difficult to make. There are only 13 talisman arrows in the quiver, so you have to use them sparingly on the battlefield. Ning Ke seriously said, Don't worry, senior brother. I won't shoot them all at once. You don't have the ability to shoot them all at once. Second brother stood up and looked at him after washing his hands by the lake. He said, with your current state, you can shoot 3 arrows at most, and your body will not be able to bear it. Looking at the heavy talisman arrow in his hand, Ning Ke frowned and said, Then what should I do? Looking at the talisman arrow, fourth brother suddenly sighed and said, This is an innovative talisman Taoism design that creates history. But it is a pity that it can't be popularized in the world. What a pity. Why can't it be popularized? Because the talisman written by youngest brother can only be matched with his psyche power. To use the talisman arrow, the archer must be a talisman master himself. There are few talisman masters in the world who can write this talisman, and the one who can is not a powerful archer. This iron bow is not so easy to pull. Hearing fourth brother's words, Ning Ke felt a soreness in his right shoulder, and even a tearing sharp pain. Maybe the muscle there was injured by the previous action of controlling the bowstring. Fourth brother said, Youngest brother, this is the talisman arrow you developed. Give it a name. Looking at the smile on fourth brother's face, Ning Ke suddenly thought of something and sincerely said, "Fourth brother, please give it a name." Fourth brother was slightly stunned and smiled with emotion. He said, "Well, since the materials of the bow and arrow are mixed with mixed silver, which you are most sensitive to, how about calling it Silver Arrow?" Hearing the two words, Silver Arrow, Ning Ke's expression became a little strange. Second brother said expressionlessly, "Change another one." Chin Pippi pointed to the sky and asked, "Cloud-piercing arrow?" Ning Ke shook his head repeatedly. A cloud-piercing arrow brought thousands of troops and horses to meet him. After a moment of silence, second brother said, "The talisman arrow moves with the chi of heaven and earth. There are only 13 of them in the world, and youngest brother is the 13th. So, let's call it primordial 13 arrows. My spirit is too low. I really can't finish this volume today. I will finish it tomorrow. Bow and leave the stage. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 196. Tobacco and alcohol were inseparable, men and women were inseparable, and naturally, weapons and arrows were inseparable. Holding the heavy talisman arrows, Ning Ke beamed with joy. Sixth brother walked out of the iron forging room with a long cloth bag. He opened the bag and revealed 3 padeos inside. These were the 3 swords that Ning Ke had sent to the back mountain a few days ago. After being hammered and tempered by sixth brother, the blades looked more slender than before, and the long black hilts looked more solid. The slightly dark surface reflected the morning light, and occasionally a few simple and clear talisman lines could be seen. They looked a little delicate, but also full of endless murderous aura. Second brother said, "The West Hill Divine Palace has issued an edict. There should be a lot of young masters from various countries going to the wilderness this time. I think the judicial department will also send people there. Maybe you will meet Long Qing again in the north of Yen Kingdom." Hearing Long Qing's name, Ning Ke's scalp tightened involuntarily. He subconsciously had a strong thought of disappearing. He had defeated Prince Long Qing once in climbing the mountain, but the real gap between their cultivation states was too big. If Prince Long Qing bore a grudge against the 2 previous humiliations, he would probably suffer a lot in the hands of Prince Long Qing. "I won't see you off tomorrow. I just want to remind you." Second brother continued, "You will be leading the students of the academy to the wilderness this time, representing the senior brothers and sisters of the second floor. You will be carrying the banner of the headmaster. So no matter what happens, you cannot disgrace the academy. The Revelation Institute of West Hill, the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom, and the White Tower Temple of Yueluan. The disciples of the academy have had a lot of contact with these guys in the past. They have never lost in chess or musical performances. You cannot lose either. Why are we not allowed to lose? Not bad. What if I can't beat him? I can't lose face even if I can't win." Ning Ke scratched his head and asked in confusion and distress, "Second brother, how can I not lose face if I can't beat him?" Second brother raised his eyebrows slightly and reprimanded unhappily, "If you can't win, you have to find a way to win. If you really can't win, you can't admit defeat. You have to find a way to escape. After cultivating for a few years, you can go back and fight with your opponent again. Do you think you can never win?" Because of His Majesty's suggestion, the Academy's students would be practicing in the wilderness of the north of Yen Kingdom this year, and the departure time was tomorrow. When Ning Ke walked out of the thick fog at the back of the mountain of the academy, the serious voices of instructors were echoing in the study rooms around the stone ground. Outside the warehouse, there were stewards carrying out the things needed for the journey, and the stewards of the military ministry were counting the number of weapons. Walking out of the stone gate of the academy, he saw dozens of horses scattered on the green meadow under the morning light. These horses from the horse farm in the west of the city were calmly grazing with their heads lowered. Occasionally, they would bump into the flowers in the depths of the meadow and knock down the autumn petals. Ning Ke looked at the warhorses that were about to embark on their journey and smiled. He apologized to the coachman, old Duan, who had been waiting outside the courtyard for a whole night, and was ready to board the carriage to return to the city. At this moment, he suddenly thought of a problem. He frowned and jumped off the carriage. He walked back to the academy's warehouse and borrowed a sturdy leather bag. He picked up dozens of heavy stones and stuffed them into the bag. After weighing the stones in his hand, he felt that the weight of the stones in the bag was about the same. He walked to the edge of the meadow, held the fence with his hand, and whistled to the depths of the meadow. The whistle was not very loud, but it alerted the warhorses that were grazing on the meadow and raised their heads. One of the strongest big yellow horses shook its head and pushed its companions away, galloping happily towards Ning, Quebec. He touched the big yellow horse and tied the leather bag to the buckle next to the saddle through the fence. The leather bag was stuffed with stones. It looked inconspicuous, but was actually very heavy. The big yellow horse bent its forelegs slightly and then quickly stood up straight. However, the balance of its strong body seemed to be a little problematic, and it panted a little faster. Ning Ke untied the leather bag and looked at the big yellow horse, shaking his head. He thought that the iron bow, 13 arrows and 3 knives were already too heavy. Adding his own weight, even if these ordinary warhorses could bear it, they could not bear it for too long, especially in the wilderness. Once they started a chase, they could not maintain it for too long. Having been a soldier at the frontier fortress of the city of Wei for a long time, he knew better than any other student of the academy how important it was to ride in the wilderness. Now that he had entered the world of cultivation, he was even more clear that as long as one was not a grand cultivator in the knowing destiny state, he still needed to rely on horses to maintain sufficient speed. After thinking for a while, a scene from last year suddenly appeared in his mind. He poured out the stones in the leather bag, jumped into the meadow, and found the steward of the military ministry's horse farm. He took out the waist token of the Imperial Center administration and whispered something to him. After returning to Chang'an, he did not return to Lin 47th Street immediately. Instead, he went to the Southern Gate Taoist Temple at the foot of the Imperial City. As a disciple, he had to report to his master that he was going to travel far, and maybe his master would give him some gifts. Master Yen Sei knew that Ning Ke was going to the wilderness earlier than himself. After thinking about it these days, he felt that His Majesty's arrangement was always good for his disciple, so he gradually calmed down his annoyance. Unlike second brother, he did not tell Ning Ke not to disgrace the prestige of the academy. Instead, he said seriously, the barbarians on the grassland are not terrible, but the desolate man and his companions returning to the south will be the greatest danger. Logically speaking, with the headmaster of the academy, His Majesty, and me, few people in the world dare to harm you. But you have to remember that it is not the Tang Empire. Master, don't worry. Ning Ke said with a smile. The distant wilderness often represented mystery and danger for people from the Central Plains. But for Ning Ke, who had been killing horse gang in the wilderness since he left Min Mountain, it was the most familiar place for him. No matter how powerful the enemy he encountered there was, he believed that he could at least keep his life. Without this confidence, he would not have agreed to the request of the imperial court. Thinking of the papal cavalrymen sent by the Divine Hall this time and the powerhouses of the judicial department hidden in the dark, Master Yen Sei frowned slowly and looked at Ning Ke seriously. He said, in the past, the enemies you met in the wilderness were all ordinary people. Even the most ferocious horse gang might not make you feel afraid. But you have to remember that the enemy you will face this time may be cultivators or the remnants of the devil's doctrine hidden among the desolate man. Anyway, you have to be careful. Ning Ke stopped smiling and said seriously, I understand. Next, Master Yen Sei finished the last lesson before the arrival of autumn. He explained in detail the pinnacle of talisman Taoism, the wonderful meaning of characters. Then he handed a brocade bag to Ning Ke and explained that there were some wonderful things in the bag. If he was really in danger, he might as well open it and have a look. The black horse carriage slowly drove on the straight long street. With the cracks of the flagstones under the wheels shaking from time to time, Ning Kei looked at the brocade bag in his hand and could not help laughing. Sure enough, he got some parting gifts. He could not guess what was in the brocade bag. Thinking of those famous scenes in novels, he did not want to open it. If it was opened, it would be useless. Would he have the face to go back to the Southern Gate Temple and ask for another one from Master Yensei? Well, with his temperament, he could really do such a thing. But why bother? It was already dusk when he returned to the old brush pen shop. The setting sun shone from the end of Lin 47th Street, turning half of the street red. He said hello to Mr. Wu of the antique shop next door, glanced at the empty gray wall behind him, and walked in. The rice was steamed in the pot, and white steam filled the air. It slowly curled up along the tree in the courtyard and floated towards the red sky. It didn't float too high before dissipating in the air, leaving not even a trace. Sang Sang looked up at the fog dissipating in the air with her willowy eyes squinting beautifully. Ning Kei looked at the little figure beside the tree and said, "I'm back." Sang Sang looked back at him and said, "Young master, you're back." For many years, whenever Ning Kei returned to the hunting house or the small courtyard in the city of Wei, he would have such a conversation with the little girl in the courtyard. It was no exception this year at Lin 47th Street in Chang'an City. The only difference was that he added the word "young master" in the middle. The dinner before leaving was also the same. Although the bowl of amber chicken soup expressed some kind of solemnity, there was really nothing to say. Since there was nothing to say, Ning Kei lay on the bed and began to sleep after washing his feet and turning off the light. He did not say anything to the little girl on the other side of the bed. Although this would be the first time that he would be separated from Sang Sang for such a long time, he believed that the little girl could take good care of herself. Because the little girl had been taking care of both of their lives these years. Now that he was not a troublemaker, she should be happier and more relaxed. In Chang'an at the end of summer, the temperature at night was no longer that annoying. The cicadas on the tree gradually disappeared. The sky full of stars shone on the quiet leaves, and then reflected from the window, painting the wall and bed with their favorite silver color. With a rustling sound, Sang Sang crawled over from the other side of the bed in thin clothes. Her skinny knees pressed on the silver bedding, and then she lay in Ning Kei's arms. Ning Kei opened his eyes and said, "I have said many times that you are a big girl now." Sang Sang hummed and adjusted her position. She put her head on his chest and refused to move again. The night before their departure was no different from many other nights in the past. The morning before parting was the same as the mornings of the previous year. There was no difference. After eating a bowl of hot and sour noodle slice soup bought by Sang Sang, Ning Kei brushed his teeth with the toothbrush Sang Sang gave him and washed his face with the towel Sang Sang wrung. With the help of Sang Sang's small hands, Ning Kei picked up the heavy luggage, opened the door and walked out. The morning light was clear and bright. He waved to the little girl at the door, and the horse carriage slowly moved. At the edge of the large meadow in front of the academy, the black horse carriage stopped and turned back. Today the coachman Old Duan did not need to wait for Ning Kei to return to the city, because Ning Kei would not return to the city. The meadow was already a boiling cauldron of voices. The excited and nervous students of the academy said goodbye to their parents. The parents seemed to have endless things to say, and there seemed to be something missing in the luggage they prepared for their children. However, the young students' thoughts had already drifted to the distant north, as if they saw a bright future of achievements. Of course, not all the students of the academy were so excited and looking forward to the next journey. For example, Chu Yuxian, who was surrounded by the rich businessmen in Eastern City and several concubines in the distance, had a face full of complaints and fear. Ning Kei looked over there and smiled. Then he turned to look at Situilan, who was wearing a red archery outfit and looked valiant. He curiously said, "I didn't expect that no one would see you off." Situilan smiled and said, "It's called cultivation, but it's actually a battle." My father only encouraged me to go to the battlefield and kill the enemy, but he didn't want anyone to see me off. Besides, you don't have anyone to see you off either. Ning Ke shook his head and said, I have no parents or relatives. Who would see me off? Situilan looked at the two people coming out of the academy and said, it seems that someone will come to see you off. It was third sister Yu Lian and Chen Pipi who came out of the academy. The students of the academy and the elders on the meadow knew their identities through the teaching office, and hurriedly made way for them. The autumn breeze softly blew the hair on the woman's forehead, making this proud and small female professor, whose real age could not be seen, look a little younger. Since entering the second floor of the academy, Ning Ke rarely had a chance to talk with third sister in private. Seeing her coming to see him off, he could not help feeling a little surprised and said, Thank you, senior sister. Yu Lian gave him a small object and said with a smile, I don't have anything to give you, but I'll give you a message. No matter what happens, you just need to follow your heart and you'll be able to overcome it easily. Thank you, senior sister. Ning Ke turned to Chen Pipi and looked at this friend who had brought endless help to his cultivation. After a moment of silence, he smiled and said, What are you going to give me? A gust of morning wind came to the meadow and wrinkled Chen Pipi's face. He said seriously, I'll see you off, okay? Ning Ke shook his head and sighed. You're getting more and more shameless. Chen Pipi sighed and said, I'll learn from you. Ning Ke answered with a smile, We'll make progress together. Chen Pipi also smiled and then asked seriously, Do you have anything to tell me? Ning Ke wanted to say that he had already told him what he should, but he still said after thinking, You know. What do I know? I have a little handmaiden at home. From a young soldier from the border town, to climbing the stairs and defeating the third young master Xia, to being forgotten by the academy, and then to being forgotten by the academy, to climbing the stairs and defeating Prince Long Qing, to finally become the only student to enter the second floor, and then to lead all his classmates to the wilderness of the north of Yan Kingdom for practice. Now, Ning Ke had undoubtedly become a legend in the eyes of the ordinary students of the academy. His conversation with Situilan had already attracted a lot of attention. Then, following the arrival of Professor Yu Lian and Chen Pipi, even more gazes fell on him. These gazes were extremely complicated. Some were respectful, some were envious, and some were jealous, but none dared to show any hatred. When Ning Ke picked up the heavy luggage at his feet and walked towards the meadow, the dozens of eyes that had been silently watching him were filled with shock and confusion. What kind of horse would be able to withstand so much baggage and look so heavy? Why was he walking toward the meadow? 3 padeos, a dismantled iron bow and 13 talisman arrows in the quiver, a boxwood bow and ordinary arrows, and even a small folded tent and a big black umbrella tightly wrapped in coarse cloth were the necessities of the journey. The luggage had been carefully organized by Sang Sang last night, and its volume had been reduced to the point where it could not be reduced anymore. But because there were so many things, it still looked spectacular when put together, like a small mountain. Ning Ke carried the heavy luggage and walked to the meadow fence, looking into the distance to find his target. On the other side of the fence, the remaining military horses that had been defeated by the academy students were silently eating grass or resting with their heads down. It was hard to tell whether they were dispirited or not. In the wide meadow further away, a black shadow was running back and forth, like a black thunder, and the sound of hooves was loud. When the black shadow slowed down, it could be seen clearly that it was an extremely strong black horse. The big black horse kept chasing and bumping into its companions. The other horses ran away in fear, but the big black horse continued to chase and bite them. It neighed proudly from time to time, which made it seem particularly domineering and mean. Ning Ke looked at the big black horse and smiled. He put his finger in his mouth and whistled. The whistling sound spread to the top of the meadow. The big black horse, who was arrogantly bullying its companions, suddenly stiffened when it heard the whistle. Its 4 legs were like nails nailed into the soft grass, and it could not move even half a step. It looked like a wooden horse that had been painted black. Only two big black eyes were moving quickly, and one could clearly see the fear in them. It twisted its stiff neck with difficulty and looked back at the figure by the fence in the distance. It finally connected the most unpleasant memory in its mind with this person. Another whistle sounded, as if it was urging it to move. The big black horse lifted its hooves with difficulty and walked slowly to the fence with its head down. Every step was so reluctant, as if it was a female star who was about to marry into a notorious rich family and did not know what her future would be like. The big black horse strolled to the fence and looked at Ning Kai behind the fence. It shook its head slightly and flipped its thick lips in a funny way, as if it was expressing absolute submission and flattery. It had been more than a year since the academy entrance examination of the academy. The big black horse's temper had not improved at all. It was still violent and irritable. However, in front of Ning Kai, it still did not dare to lose its temper. However, when it saw the luggage that was like a small hill under Ning Kai's feet, it could no longer care about its instinctive fear. It let out a frightened neigh and turned around, ready to run away. Ning Kai stared at it and said, "Old rules." The big black horse stopped. Ning Kai continued, "If you don't listen to me, I'll kill you." The big black horse lowered its head and turned around. Ning Kai hung the mountain-like luggage on its saddle. At the end of summer and the beginning of autumn in the 14th year of Tianqi era, the academy began this year's practical cultivation. The leader was the weakest disciple of the second floor of the academy in history, who had not even met the teacher and eldest brother. In the backyard of the old brush pen shop, Sang Sang stared at the old hen and thought that she should have killed it yesterday so that it could eat more. Otherwise, what if it got hungry on the way? On the outskirts of Chang'an, Ning Kai looked at the picturesque village and thought that he would not be able to drink the chicken soup she made for many days. He had just left and he already missed it. The empire was shrouded in a faint glimmer in the early morning. The sound of hooves and the fluttering indigo clothes. Volume 1, The End of the Empire in the Early Morning. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 197. In the 14th year of the Tang Tianqi era, the wild tribe, who had been wandering in the cold region of the far north for thousands of years, returned to the south and occupied the grassland of the left king's palace. This led to the palace's cavalry to harass and attack the central plains further south. In order to deal with the unprecedented danger, the West Hill Divine Palace issued an edict, calling on the followers of Haotian Taoism and the righteous to help the Yan kingdom against the barbarian invasion. At the same time, the Tang Empire sent troops from the west to aid the Yan kingdom. Because of the arrival of the reinforcements, the left king's palace's cavalry became much more restrained. Especially when the vanguard of the Tang Empire's Yan Kingdom army came to the wilderness of northern Yan along the eastern edge of Min Mountain, the left king's palace Chanyu tightened the restrictions on the tribes. It was hard to find any trace of the barbarian cavalry in the windy wilderness. The reason why the barbarian cavalry was difficult to deal with was that they had a large grassland behind them. They would hide in the long grass once they saw something was wrong, making it impossible for them to pursue. Unless the current monarchs had the ambition of Emperor Taizu of the Tang dynasty, there was no way to completely eliminate this threat. Therefore, when the barbarian cavalry's invasion of the Yan kingdom became less serious and the left king's palace sent messengers to negotiate, the Central Plains troops gathered in the north of the Yan kingdom did not go north. Instead, they chose to stay and focus on the defense of the various border fortresses. The situation at the border fortress became much calmer. The 100,000 troops stationed outside the Yan kingdom were called the Central Plains Coalition Army. In fact, other than the young cultivators from the South Jin Kingdom and Yueluan Kingdom, they were basically the Yan kingdom's own troops and the Tang Empire's reinforcement. The so-called reinforcement was the elite troops of the West King's border army under the command of General Xiahou. This troop, known for its ruthlessness, had conquered 11 cities of the Yan kingdom in the war 10 years ago, leaving a painful memory for the Yan people. In the eyes of the Yan people, the Tang Empire's reinforcement was more abominable and terrifying than the barbarian cavalry on the grassland. Due to such simple feelings and the contrast of power, the Yan Kingdom's monarch and ordinary soldiers all showed a certain degree of vigilance towards the Tang Empire's reinforcement in the west. Although they still sent pigs and cattle as a greeting on the surface, in fact, the Yan Kingdom's troops kept a considerable distance from the Tang Empire's reinforcement. The two sides occupied the east and west front lines of the Yan Kingdom's northern border. They looked at each other from afar and ignored each other. They even paid great attention to each other's movements. The young cultivators who had received the edict from the West Hill Divine Palace naturally stayed with the Yan Kingdom's army, while the students from the Southern Academy in Cheng naturally stayed in the camp of the Tang Empire's reinforcement army. It was already the end of autumn, and the northern part of the wilderness was cold. The air turned into fog, and the grass had already turned yellow. Somewhere in the north of Yan Kingdom, there was a meadow outside a military camp at the frontier fortress. The few trees on the meadow had already lost all their leaves. Standing there, one could easily see through the clear sky and into the distance. For example, the black smoke from some unknown object burning in the wilderness in the distance, and the injured soldiers lying on the creaking carriages. Now that the situation at the frontier fortress was calm, it was possible that peace talks would be held soon. However, in the depths of the wilderness, small-scale battles between the Tang cavalry and the grassland cavalry still occurred occasionally. Every few days, bodies and wounded would be transported back. Ning Kai sat on the meadow and looked to the northwest. His hand on his knee was slowly stroking a small token. The material of the token was a little strange. It was not gold, jade, stone, or wood, but it was very hard. It was given to him by senior sister Yu Lian before he left the academy. He did not pay attention to it at that time, but he remembered it later on the journey. He often held it in his hand and played with it. He was a little curious about the purpose of this token, and also used it to reduce his nostalgia for Chang'an. There was a blurry black line under the high sky in the northwest direction. It did not look conspicuous at all. However, he had been there, and he knew how tall and majestic the undulating mountains were. Therefore, he increasingly felt that the sky and the wilderness were indescribably vast. The blurry black line was the majestic Min Mountain that divided the northern part of the continent into two parts. He and Sang Sang mainly lived in the eastern foothills of the Min Mountain when they were young. 10 years ago, when they walked out from the western cliff, they met Joyer, whose home had been destroyed. That memory was very long ago, but it was still clear. Because he had been there, he remembered that there would be a naturally formed gap in the middle of the Min Mountain. The Min Mountain, which stretched for thousands of miles from the south to the north, divided the southern part of the wilderness into two halves, and also separated the Tang Empire from the Yan Kingdom. If they did not want to go around the northern part of the wilderness, the army had to pass through that gap. Such an important military location was, of course, firmly controlled by the Tang Empire. The most elite division of the Empire's Northern Road Army was stationed there. The most important military mission of the Empire's Northern Road Army was not to guard the dangerous place or to threaten the Left Tent Palace or the Yan Kingdom in the eastern part of the grassland. What really worried the Empire was the most powerful Golden Palace in the wilderness, which was also the place where Princess Li Yu had been married. The military fortress of the city of Wei, where Ning Kai had lived for many years, was one of the 7 citadels. The 7 citadels belonged to the most inconspicuous frontier fortress defense line of the elite division of the Northern Road Army. At this moment, looking northwest, he seemed to be able to see the city of Wei on the other side of the Min Mountain, the hometown that truly belonged to him and Sang Sang. He could not help but feel some longing and warmth in his heart. He did not know how the old people in the city of Wei were doing now, or how General Ma was doing. He did not know if they had received the banknotes sent by the carriage and horse company in spring. If they knew that he had made a name for himself in Chang'an, how much wine would they drink to celebrate? And when should he and Sang Sang go back to see them? We have been stationed here for more than a month, and we have only sent some cavalry out for reconnaissance. When will we really attack? It will be winter in a few days, and the soldiers will have to pay a higher price when they enter the wilderness. A young officer sat beside Ning Ke, and his light armor was polished. Looking at the empty wilderness and the wounded soldiers on the horse carriages, he frowned slightly and said angrily, "I really don't know what the general's mansion is thinking. I heard that General Xiahou did not even enter the Yan kingdom and is still in the Tiang city mansion. It is really outrageous." Ning Ke looked at him and smiled, saying, "There is no need to use a butcher's knife to kill a chicken. General Xiahou does not need to deal with the cavalry of the left king's palace in person. The imperial court has sent half of the western military army here, which is enough to show respect to the left king's palace. General Xiahou stayed in Tiang city and did not come to the frontier fortress to command in person, because he knew that the war would not start. Since there is no need to go deep into the wilderness, what is the difference between autumn and winter?" The young officer was Chang Jingming, a student of the academy. He had excellent results in riding and archery in the military ministry, and had once served in the Yulin Royal Guards. This time, he came to the front of the Yan army and was assigned to the northernmost and most dangerous fortress. However, he did not have any objection, and instead was eager to lead the cavalry into the wilderness and make great achievements for the empire like his predecessors. He did not expect that they would be trapped for more than a month, and the troops did not have the intention to go into battle at all. He had been feeling a little depressed these days, and when he heard Ning Ke's words, he retorted, "The countries in the Central Plains have made such a big movement, and the Divine Hall has issued an edict, and the Empire has sent out reinforcements. It would cost a lot of money just to feed the troops every day, and it took them so much effort to gather all the troops. How could they not fight?" Ning Ke said with a smile, "Then do you think they are going to fight?" Chang Jingming pointed at the horse carriages below the meadow and said, "Small-scale battles have been happening all the time. I don't think they are not going to fight, but the coalition forces are just arguing, and there is no way to confirm when they will start a large-scale attack." Ning Ke shook his head and said, "Small-scale battles will definitely continue, but that is for the negotiation and bargaining with the left king's palace. You have to figure out the ultimate purpose of the 200,000 troops in the south of the wilderness. If you understand this, you will know why the war will not happen after all." "Why?" Chang Jingming frowned and asked. Ning Ke asked, "Why does the left king's palace want to disturb the border?" Chang Jingming answered without thinking, "Because the barbarians are cruel and greedy by nature." Ning Ke said grumpily, "Nonsense. Everyone is greedy." Chang Jingming hesitated and said, "Is it because the desolate men are moving south?" Ning Ke looked at the young officer and said, "The real enemy of Chanyu of the left king's palace is the desolate man tribe behind them. The West Hill Divine Palace issued the edict to guard against the possible revival of the devil's doctrine caused by the desolate men moving south. As for the Tang Empire, the desolate men were crippled by us in the past, so of course we have to guard against them taking revenge after they become strong. So in the end, everyone is worried about the desolate man warriors in a more distant place. The desolate man had been away from the wilderness for more than 1,000 years. For the people of the Central Plains, it was a legend that was so long ago that it was hard to remember. On the journey to the frontier fortress, the students of the academy had crammed some knowledge and roughly understood the long history. But for them and the people of the Central Plains, this tribe was still extremely mysterious. "But I heard that there are only a few 100,000 desolate men left now. Even if all of them are soldiers, they can't pose any threat to the Central Plains. On the contrary, the left king's palace has countless good knights. If they really move south like locusts." The left king's palace, which is powerful in your eyes, was robbed of a large grassland by the desolate men. They were driven south and forced to cross the line that the Tang Empire drew for them. Now these desolate men, who are known as natural warriors, can do this with only a few 100,000 people. If they are given time to stand firm in the north and multiply, don't you think it's terrifying? Why wouldn't the West Hill Divine Palace and the Imperial Court be nervous? Ning Ke said with a smile, "Don't forget, as long as there is enough food, it's always easy to have children. Chang Jingming asked after a long silence. Then what should we do? Ning Ke looked at the black smoke in the distance of the vast wilderness and said after thinking for a moment, looking at the current situation, I guess the Westhill Divine Palace and the Imperial Court have the same idea, which is to force Chanyu of the Left King's Palace to start a new war with the desolate men. We are responsible for providing him with military equipment and food, and they are responsible for fighting. Chang Jingming asked in confusion, the desolate men are forced to move south because they can't win. Why would the Left King's Palace be so stupid to turn back and fight? That's why we are here now. The Divine Hall and the Imperial Court have made their stance very clear. They have written a multiple-choice question for Chanyu to choose. Either you fight with us, or you fight with the desolate men with our support. You will definitely die in the former, but you might die in the latter. There's always a difference between certain and possible. Chang Jingming was stunned. He didn't expect things to be so complicated. He said with emotion, this multiple-choice question is really hard to choose. Ning Ke patted his shoulder and said, Chanyu thinks so too. At this moment, dozens of the most elite light cavalry from the West Road appeared at the back of the meadow. The captain looked at Ning Ke, who was above the meadow, anxiously, as if he wanted to get closer but didn't dare to. Chang Jingming looked at the elite cavalry under the meadow, as if they were facing a formidable enemy. He recognized that they should be the direct cavalry of the general's mansion. He couldn't help but be slightly shocked and subconsciously looked at Ning Ke beside him. The Tang captain under the meadow looked up at Ning Ke and said worriedly, Mr. 13, it's too close to the barbarians. It's really not safe. Let's go back to the military camp. Mr. 13? Chang Jingming looked at Ning Ke and asked in confusion. Ning Ke looked at the nervous cavalry under the meadow and sighed helplessly. He stood up and explained to Chang Jingming, they don't know who I am. They only know that I'm the 13th. Chang Jingming also stood up. I'm the leader of the academy. Although I'm not responsible for your life and death, I still have to care about what you're doing. Ning Ke looked at him and said, I'm here today to see how you're doing. Since I'm being urged, I have to leave early. I'll go to the Blue Water Battalion tomorrow. Situilan and Wang Ying are there. Thank you for your hard work. Chang Jingming said seriously. I'm just an inspector who is put on a pedestal, eating and drinking everywhere. What hard work is there to talk about? Ning Ke laughed at himself and waved his hand to indicate that he didn't need to see him off. He patted his butt and walked down the meadow. When he reached the meadow, he looked at the border captain who had followed him for a whole month and the soldiers who were looking around vigilantly as if they would encounter the grassland cavalry at any time. He said helplessly, this is still the Tang military camp. Why are you so nervous? Are you really going to follow me like this every day? The captain replied seriously, the higher-ups have given strict orders that we must ensure your safety. Ning Ke thought of the free and boring life at the frontier fortress for more than a month and couldn't help but shake his head. He said, I'm just an ordinary practical cultivator. How can I be followed by dozens of elite cavalrymen every day? I'm not General Xiahou. I can't afford such treatment. The captain explained respectfully, Mr. 13, although we don't know your real identity, the order from the general's mansion clearly states that your safety is more important than that of the general. This was a very true answer. There were not many people in the West Road Army who knew Ning Ke's true identity. The reason why the general's mansion was so concerned about Ning Ke's safety was not because General Xiahou knew that he was a secret guard and had come with His Majesty's supervision mission. It was because of a very simple reason. Dozens of students of the academy were practicing in the front line. They had to use real swords and spears to hone their military skills. This was the practice of the Tang Empire. Therefore, from the ministers in the court to the generals at the frontier fortress, they would only treat these young people as ordinary military officers. However, Ning Ke was not an ordinary student of the academy. He was a student of the second floor of the academy. All these years, there had never been a student of the second floor of the academy joining the military for practical cultivation. Ning Ke was the only exception. As a core disciple of the headmaster of the academy, if something happened to such a person in the front line, even if he lost a hair, it would cause a huge uproar. General Xiahou might be able to bear the anger of His Majesty, but he didn't have the courage to face the disappointment of the headmaster of the academy. Therefore, after coming from Chang and to the frontier fortress of the wilderness of the north of Yan Kingdom, Ning Ke did not return to the familiar days of fighting on horseback. Instead, he was treated like an ancestor by the West Road Army. The entire military camp carefully protected his safety. Whether it was drinking or eating meat, they satisfied any of his requests, but they would never let him get close to any possible danger. Therefore, apart from following the ups and downs of the frontier fortress to visit the academy students like Chang Jingming, there was nothing else he could do. Ning Ke looked at the cavalrymen who were respectfully waiting to escort him away. He could not help but sigh. He put his finger in his mouth and whistled. A big black horse rushed out from the back of the meadow. The big black horse was carrying a heavy luggage, but it still galloped and kept chewing. No one knew what it was eating that made it so happy on the meadow where the leaves had fallen and the grass was covered with frost. First, I strongly recommend Miss Futian's new book, The Treacherous Official. I can absolutely guarantee it with my credit. It's a good book in line with my 3 views and aesthetic standards. Now it's the first book on the list of new books. It's the one that's more popular than Bean. Second, the new assistant, Pomelo, has taken office. I applaud and cheer. She's a little girl. Please help and be considerate. If there's anything wrong, it's all my fault. I cupped my hands. Third, the beginning is really the most difficult. I started writing at 12:00 today. I'm really stupid. I deleted and wrote again and again. I changed many ways and finally chose the driest way. I skipped a lot of instructions in the middle. I feel sad when I think of the money I've lost. Fourth, it's almost Monday. I strongly need recommendation votes. Please give me your support. Please don't force me to write a single chapter tomorrow. Fifth, I'm really scared about the second volume. I hope you can praise me and give me positive energy. I believe I can overcome the difficulties and write better and better. Good night, everyone. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 198. The wind didn't blow in the border camp at night, and the bright red tongues of fire on the woodpile could gently shake their waists. Dozens of Tang border army elites were scattered around, either in deep sleep or vigilantly standing guard. Only Ning Ke and the captain were sitting by the fire. In the daytime, the captain called Ning Ke Mr. 13, as if he didn't know his real identity. However, at this time, beside the red warm fire, his title had been changed in a whisper. Your Excellency Ning, do you really want to go to Dongxing Stockade Village tomorrow? It's too close to Yan Kingdom. There may be trouble. Ning Ke was fiddling with the sweet potatoes in the fire with a branch. Hearing this, he looked up at him and couldn't help shaking his head. Looking around at the border army elites who didn't pay attention to him, he said, I've stayed in the frontier fortress for more than a month, but I didn't get into any trouble. In my opinion, this is the real trouble. He looked at the captain's seemingly dull and honest face and sighed, speaking of which, isn't our luck a bit too bad? You are the only secret bodyguard in Tiang City, but you are sent to follow me. So I don't know who to ask if I want to ask about the situation in Tiang City. The captain said with a wry smile, I also feel helpless when I know it's me who personally protects your excellency. Could it be that General's mansion knows your identity as a secret bodyguard, but they are too embarrassed to do anything to you, so they simply drive you out of Tiang City and follow me around, or have they even found out my identity? The captain shook his head and said, Please rest assured, Your Excellency. My identity should not be leaked. As for Your Excellency, I think neither the military counselor or the inner vanguard camp can guess that you are actually the secret bodyguard of His Majesty. Ning Ke pulled out 2 roasted sweet potatoes from the fire and gave one to the captain. He grabbed it with his fingertips and slowly tore off the skin of the other sweet potato. He lowered his head and began to gnaw on the steaming white flesh. He said vaguely, "It's fine as long as no one finds out. I don't want to be watched by someone in the dark whenever I do something." The captain picked up the cooked sweet potato that rolled to his feet and looked at Ning Ke's face reflected by the fire, not knowing what to say. He had mixed feelings about Mr. 13 next to him. Other soldiers might not know Ning Ke's identity, but he was a secret guard. Of course, he knew that Ning Ke was a core disciple of the headmaster of academy. Why would such a distinguished bigwig come to the frontier fortress? What puzzled him even more was that they had to do such a troublesome thing. Why bother? It should be known that this was the wilderness with few people. This was a battlefield where long grasses hid bones. If one really angered General Xiahou, the general would not care whether you were a student of the 2nd floor of the academy or not. He would kill you and throw you into the depths of the grassland. Who would know how you died? Even the headmaster couldn't do anything about it. A faint sound came from afar. The cavalryman in charge of the night patrol stood up and walked toward the periphery. The captain glanced in that direction and changed the way he addressed him for the sake of safety. He said softly, "Mr. 13, what are you here to investigate?" With a goal in mind, this subordinate can make arrangements. "I came to the frontier fortress not to investigate anything, but to take a look on behalf of His Majesty." Ning Ke threw the half-eaten sweet potato into the fire and wiped the residue on his face with his sleeve. He said, "But according to the current situation, there is no way to see anything. You have a special identity. The general's mansion is worried that something will happen to you. They also don't want you to get into trouble. Of course, they want you to stay as far away as possible. If you want to see someone in the general's mansion, you can't see him without going to Tiang City." The captain hesitated for a moment and then directly mentioned Tiang City. He knew very well that an important figure like Mr. 13, who had received His Majesty's secret order to come to the frontier fortress to inspect on behalf of the Son of Heaven, was only qualified to enjoy such treatment. However, he still did not dare to directly say General Xiahou's name. The students of the academy had passed through Tiang City on their way from Chang'an City to the frontier fortress of northern Yan Kingdom. At that time, the general's mansion was in charge of receiving them, so Ning Ke had not seen General Xiahou in person. Now hearing the words, Tiang City, he thought of the famous general in Tiang City who was known for his violence. After a moment of silence, he said with a smile, "I will go there in the future." The next day, Ning Ke and dozens of elite soldiers of the Tang army who protected him set off again. They marched to the east along the simple frontier fortress defense line in the north of Yan Kingdom. It was just past noon when they arrived at the easternmost part of the western front line that the Tang army was responsible for. Looking over the dry willows, they could clearly see a piece of green mountains and the yellow city not far from the mountains. More than a dozen officers were waiting for their arrival outside Dongxing Stockade Village. The general of Dongxing Stockade Village did not know who Mr. 13 was. He just guessed from the documents of the general's mansion in Tiang City and the excited expressions of those subordinate officers that he should be a bigwig from Chang'an City and should have some relationship with the academy. Ning Ke looked at the officers outside the stockade village and smiled. He jumped down from the big black horse. He first exchanged a few polite words with the general and then walked to the right side. He walked to someone and said with a smile, "Are you used to staying here?" The officer in front of him was a young girl, dressed in an archery outfit and covered with dust from the wilderness. She looked at Ning Ke and said with a smile, "Although it is not as comfortable as you, I am still used to it." Ning Ke said with a smile, "You have to get used to it even if you are not used to it. I have told you before that the real battlefield is not the same as what you guys imagine in Chang'an City." Then he noticed that Linchuan Wangying was also standing among the officers. The 15-year-old boy was blown away a lot of immaturity by the wind and sand of the frontier fortress, and his posture seemed to be a lot taller. He looked at these academy students who had come to the front line for less than a month, but their temperament and spirit had changed a lot from when they were in Chang'an City. He said with appreciation, "It seems that everyone is still very used to the life here. I am relieved." The general of Dongxing Stockade Village followed him. Seeing that Ning Ke did not pay attention to him, he was a little unhappy. He thought that even if Ning Ke was a bigwig from Chang'an City, he was not qualified to put on airs in the military camp. However, when he heard this dialogue, he immediately understood that Mr. 13 was really a bigwig who could not be provoked. Anyone who dared to speak like this to the daughter of General Yunhui and dared to put on airs to the academy students was a real bigwig. The training goal of the academy students in the future was to become officials of the imperial court, and they would not have anything to do with the military system. However, the Tang Empire was founded by martial arts, and frontline practice was an indispensable part of the training plan. Dongxing Stockade Village was located in the easternmost part of the Tang Army's defense line. It was very close to a tribe of the left king's palace, and it was also very close to the Yan Kingdom army and the young masters of the Central Plains who came to help. It was under double pressure, and it could be said that it was the most difficult place in the Yan Kingdom army. For thousands of years, the academy's practice principle was that students should go where the most difficult place was. Therefore, this Yellow Earth city with 3,000 troops and horses had the most academy students. In addition to the cavalry troops, there were a total of 11 academy students. On the journey from Chang'an to the frontier fortress of northern Yan Kingdom, Ning Ke and the academy students were very familiar with each other. Moreover, those who participated in the practice were all Tang students. Those disputes in the past had long disappeared. When the two sides met again after more than a month, they were naturally enthusiastic and lively. After experiencing the real bloody life on the battlefield and experiencing life and death, the young people would quickly mature. And it was because of their maturity that their enthusiasm for Ning Ke would inevitably be mixed with some admiration and a sense of distance. After all, Ning Ke was a student of the second floor of the academy, and his identity and status had been far away from theirs. By the blue lake, Situilan took out a handkerchief and wet it to wipe off the dust on her forehead. She looked back at the silent Ning Ke and asked, "Are you not used to being surrounded by people?" Ning Ke walked to the lakeside, looked at the shadow of the old wood at the bottom of the lake, and said with a smile, "Being surrounded by people and being respected is the goal of people like us. You grew up in the general's mansion of Chang'an City, and the female army was famous everywhere. How could you understand the mentality of people at the bottom of the society like us?" Situilan stood up and handed the handkerchief to him, and said, "But I saw that you smiled reluctantly before." Ning Ke wiped his face and said, "In the past, these classmates ignored me. Later on the journey, they already got along with me, but now they talk to me so respectfully. The contrast is too big, and I can't adapt to it. So you want to walk with me by the lake alone?" "Yes. The army is the most particular place about social class. Military orders are like mountains. As long as it is a superior, no matter whether the military orders issued by him are reasonable or not, no matter whether you think it is to die or not, you must ride the horse and rush forward." Situilan looked at him and said, "After leaving the academy and coming to the front line, they participated in several battles and were severely beaten by the generals for several times. They naturally understood that the world still depends on strength after all." Speaking of fighting and strength, Ning Ke looked at her and said with a smile, "When I first knew you, I thought you were just a wicked girl who ran amok on the street with the help of your family background. I had never seen the legendary female army, and I didn't think it was so great. I really didn't expect that you would take the initiative to choose to come to Dongxing Stockade Village, and do such a good job here." After all, they were young talents selected from the counties of the Tang Empire. Once they adapted to the strict rules of the military camp and the cruel battle, the academy students who participated in the practice soon began to show their abilities. Although they were only low-level officers, they did a good job in the part they were responsible for. Situilan was born in a family of generals. She dared to take on tasks, and her performance was especially outstanding. She had led the cavalry into the wilderness for 6 times in less than a month since she came to Dongxing Stockade Village. Among them, she met the cavalry of the palace twice and beheaded more than 10 times. Her military merits had been reported to Tuyang City, and she was waiting to be rewarded and promoted immediately. The Lieutenant Palace doesn't have the courage to start a full-scale war. Those cavalry are not the palace's elites at all, but the cavalry of small tribes. They just write it like this for the sake of military merits. Situilan was valiant and heroic, without any arrogance, and said, "It's nothing to kill the cavalry of small tribes. If I really fight with the palace cavalry, I dare not say I can win. I can only strive to kill more." Ning Ke rubbed his stiff wrist. It had been nearly 2 years since he left the city of Wei, and his blade had not been stained with the blood of the grassland cavalry for 2 years. At this time, listening to Situ's calm and hot-blooded words, he could not help but miss those bloody times when he rode horses to Shubi Lake and chopped firewood with a knife. "In fact, I have always been curious about what kind of person you are." Situilan turned around by the lake, and her eyebrows slowly raised. She looked at Ning Ke's face with great interest and said, "My father once looked through your files in the military ministry, but he only told me some general information and refused to tell me too many details. When I asked him anxiously, he only said that if there was a chance to fight with you in the future, he would listen to everything you said. I rarely see my father speak so highly of people. What did you do in the city of Wei? I am really proud to be evaluated like this by General Yunhui." Ning Ke looked over her shoulder and fell on the blue lake, thinking of those years in the city of Wei. After a moment of silence, he said, "When I was in the city of Wei, I mainly did one thing." "What thing?" "Killing the horse gang. I heard that the horse gang in the wilderness is the fiercest. Even the cavalry of the Golden Palace is not willing to provoke them. It's not that exaggerated. But the composition of the horse gang is very complicated. There are real horse gang and homeless refugees. I have seen refugees from the north of Yan Kingdom at Shubi Lake. It is so far away, and I don't know how they crossed the Min Mountain. And you certainly can't imagine that the most powerful horse gang I have ever met is the cavalry of the Golden Palace in disguise." "The cavalry of the Golden Palace? Did you win or did they win?" "I said that I only did the thing of killing the horse gang. If they won, how could I kill them?" Ning Ke looked at her and said, "I think the reason why General Yunhui said that to you is that he probably knows that I have a good skill of killing people in the wilderness. In fact, this is not unusual." Situilan looked at him and said, "You killed so many horse gang without dying. You are very powerful." Ning Ke said, "I don't deny this. It is said that cultivators are the strongest in the world. But according to those cultivators I have met, if they are put in the wilderness, as long as they meet a team of 100 horse gang, they will never survive. But you still want to be a cultivator." "Because I can kill people. If I become a cultivator, I can become a cultivator who can kill people." Ning Ke paused for a moment and said with a smile, "I always have an idea. Don't talk about it outside." Situilan was very interested and said, "I promise I won't leak the secret." "Say it quickly." Ning Ke walked to the lakeside and looked at the blue lake extending to the north without an end. He said, "Cultivators do have strong enough personal strength. But in my opinion, these cultivators in the world do not know how to kill people." After thinking for a long time, Situilan frowned and asked, Is killing people?" Ning Ke looked at her and asked a few questions in a row. How to kill people with the least effort. How to kill people when their strength is far less than the enemy's. How to use the environment, wind and even sunlight to kill people. How to squeeze the last strength to kill people when they are seriously injured and dying. How to kill people without being killed. Situilan shook her head and thought that when she met the grassland cavalry in the wilderness, she picked up the bow and arrow to shoot, and picked up the padao to chop. How could there be so many questions? If killing people is really so complicated, can you teach me? This kind of thing can't be taught. You will naturally learn it when you kill more people. So the frontier fortress military camp is the most suitable place to practice killing skills. But cultivators rarely practice in the military camp. Ning Ke said, fortunately or unfortunately, I have lived in the military camp of the city of Wei for many years. I think this is why General Yunhui thinks I am good, and it is also what you can't understand for the time being. Situi Lan looked at him and asked curiously, you are the first disciple of the second floor of the academy to come to the frontier fortress for practice. Do you want to practice in the military camp? If there is a chance, of course I would like to try on the battlefield with the ability of a cultivator. Ning Ke started to walk again and walked along the narrow white stones by the lake to the east. He said self-mockingly, but now it seems that neither Tiang City nor the Imperial Court will give me such a chance. Situi Lan looked at his back and shook her head. Ning Ke quietly looked at the blue lake water, looked at the trees and white clouds reflected in the water in the distance, and looked at the depths of the wilderness that could not be seen by the naked eye. He felt that his fingers were more and more itchy. He did not know whether there were cultivators who specially practiced on the battlefield. He was really interested in this idea. However, what really made his hands itch was not this idea, but some very simple things. Being in the wilderness, smelling the smell of horse dung in the wind and the smell of the slightly scorched grass burning, he felt that every part of his body was slightly trembling with excitement like the 3 long knives carried behind him. It was difficult to restrain the urge to rush into the depths of the grassland and swing his knife to cut down one enemy after another. Unfortunately, the blue lake in front of him was not Shubi Lake. No one knew what the name of the lake around Dongxing Stockade Village was among the grassland barbarians. It was slender like a kidney. From here, it extended to the depths of the wilderness in the extreme north, and the end could not be seen. Because the lake was too deep, it was glowing with blue luster, like a sapphire that was melted and condensed into silk. This is a saline lake. The lake water is not drinkable, so we did not camp here. Situi Lan looked at his eyes quietly looking at the lake. She raised her arm and pointed to the forest by the lake in the distance. She said, when the barbarians' cavalry invaded the south in the past, they all drilled out from that forest. It was very sudden. But in recent days, no grassland people dare to approach here. Ning Ke looked at the faintly visible forest in the fog and asked, can we go there now? After crossing that forest, we will arrive at the eastern front of the Yen army. In order to avoid trouble, we don't go there. Of course, they don't come here. Both sides have a tacit understanding to ignore that place. Have you seen those people? Who? Young masters from various countries who came here because of the edict of the Westhill Divine Palace, such as the Sword Garret and the White Tower. Situi Lan shook her head and said, I haven't seen them. But after the last encounter with the cavalry, Dongxing Stockade Village sent troops to expel that tribe. As a result, they met the papal cavalrymen of the Westhill Divine Palace. Hearing the words, papal cavalrymen, Ning Ke turned around and asked, and then? Situi Lan thought of the scene that day and was still a little angry. She sneered and said, it was obviously the battle of our Dongxing Stockade Village, and we had basically wiped out all the enemies. As a result, those cavalrymen of the Divine Hall who had been watching coldly finally rushed up. They wanted to grab the credit? Yes, many heads were chopped off by them. Wang Ying quarreled with them, but he didn't win. Ning Ke said, I thought Wang Ying had matured a lot on the battlefield. I didn't expect him to be so childish. Situi Lan said angrily, do you think we shouldn't quarrel? Of course we shouldn't quarrel. What can we get from quarreling? When we used to collect firewood at Shubi Lake, we never quarreled with people from the 7 stockade villages who came to rob the military credit. Ning Ke looked at the calm lake, shook his head and said, we directly drew our knives and chopped. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 199. Being a soldier, Ning Ke hated snatching military exploits the most. As he said at this time, in the wilderness outside the city of Wei, if other troops of the 7 stockade villages snatched the military exploits, he and his companions would directly take out their swords to chop them. Whoever won would get the military exploits. The rules in the wilderness were so simple. The Tang army of Dongxing stockade village actually watched their military exploits being robbed by the papal cavalry of West Hill. In addition to cursing, they didn't even take out their swords to kill the other side. He was confused and inevitably angry. After a while, he calmed down, thinking that this place was far away from Tiang City, and it was not too much for the Tang generals to be low-key and conservative. He shook his head, looked at the wilderness far away from the lake and said, "If I take the troops into the wilderness to collect firewood, the West Hill will dare to grab the firewood. You see how I will deal with them." Situilan didn't say anything. She walked slowly along the lakeside with her hands behind her back. Suddenly she stopped, turned around and looked at him, saying, "My family in Chang," and sent a letter saying that they would arrange a marriage for me. The slightly cold weather made the breath from the girl's lips quickly turn into white mist, which added some beauty to her refreshing face. Ning Ke looked at the misty breath and the girl's face in front of him. He was stunned for a moment and asked, "Then?" Situilan shook her head, turned back and continued to walk along the lakeside, and said, "I don't want to marry." Upon hearing her reply, Ning Ke's mood became a little lighter, but then suddenly became a little heavier. He had an inexplicable feeling of not being able to find the right direction. He looked at the girl's back and said, "We really should be more cautious about this kind of thing." Situilan didn't look back and said with a smile, "I heard that many ministers in Chang and city want to recruit you as a son-in-law." With Ning Ke's current reputation in Chang and city, not to mention the glory of being a core disciple of the headmaster of academy, His Majesty's appreciation and love for him were enough for countless ministers to start thinking about selling their daughters and granddaughters to him. Ning Ke smiled and said, "General Yunhui probably didn't mean that." Situilan looked back at him and said, "My father knew that I was familiar with you, and he really thought about it." Ning Ke felt a little hot on his cheeks, subconsciously touched it, and didn't know how to answer. With her hands behind her back, Situilan stepped on the white round stone by the lake and continued to move forward. She said, "But I didn't agree." Ning Ke looked at the girl in light armor and her black braids swaying restlessly behind her. After a moment of silence, he could not hold back his curiosity and some kind of emotion that could not be expressed. He asked, "Why?" "Hee, because I don't want to get married." The girl's answer was concise and powerful. Her crisp laughter awakened the thin layer of ice on the surface of the lake. "There hasn't been a female general in the empire all these years. I want to be a female general, so I don't have time to think about marriage." Ning Ke could not help but feel a little ashamed as he listened to her. He kicked a weird-shaped white stone into the lake and said, "I'm focused on cultivation and have no time to think about these things." Situilan turned around and looked at the stone that smashed the thin ice and slowly sank to the bottom of the lake. After a moment of silence, she laughed heartily and looked at him and asked, "If you have time to think about it, what kind of girl do you like?" Listening to this question, Ning Ke could not help but think of the conversation with Chin Pippi in the back of the mountain of the academy. After thinking for a long time, he rubbed his chin and said seriously, "I like beautiful girls, with white skin, red phoenix eyes, red lips and a plump figure. It's better to be smart in terms of temperament. Don't always let me think about things." Situilan looked at him and shook her head. She sighed and said, "Your requirements are really not high. The ideas of most men in the world are almost the same. I can't see any novelty in you. Life was originally a very boring thing. Whether in Chang and city or in the wilderness of northern Yan Kingdom, what was the essential difference between climbing buildings every day and wandering every day? The academy students who practiced in Dongxing Stockade Village had their own combat tasks. It was impossible for them to accompany Ning Ke to stroll around the stockade village, eat, drink and chat every day. He had to stroll around the stockade village, eat, drink and chat with himself. It was extremely monotonous and boring. After a few days, he finally could not bear such a boring life anymore. He secretly led the big black horse and avoided the sight of the dozens of inseparable cavalrymen. He went out of the stockade village and came to the blue lakeside to relax. Without the dozens of cavalrymen following behind him as the second son, Ning Ke walked a little further today. He ran along the blue lake for 2 or 3 miles to the east and found a quiet lakeside to stop. He unloaded the heavy luggage on the back of the big black horse and patted it heavily on the butt. It was rare for the big black horse to have such a good time to relax. It neighed joyfully and dashed into the lake, splashing black mud on its hooves. Then it retreated to the shore at a faster speed, roaring angrily in a low voice. It trembled slightly and kept rolling its thick tongue and turning its lips. It was obvious that it was severely frozen by the cold lake water, and the taste of the salty water was really not good. I have never seen a warhorse that cares about its head and body like you. Ning Ke looked at it funny and pointed to the misty mountain forest not far away. He said, "Idiot, if there is a lake, there will be tributaries. Run over there and see if there is water to drink. Come back early later." The big black horse shook its head discontentedly and stamped its hind hooves to shake off some of the cold lake water on its body. Then it ran in the direction pointed by Ning Quebec. Ning Ke built a clay stove and cooked a pot of fresh vegetable soup. Smelling the gradually rising fragrance, he sat down by the quiet and deserted lakeside. Now there was no Sang Sang to serve him, so he had to serve himself. Fortunately, when Sang Sang was young, he needed to cook for both of them. He was still skilled in cooking and had never forgotten it. In the north of the wilderness, especially in the area between the central plains and the grassland, the northwest wind blew all year round and it was very cold. He was wearing a thick cotton-padded jacket and a black windbreaker on the outside. He just sat by the lake. He didn't know if it was because of the bowl of warm vegetable soup or because of his cultivation, but he didn't feel too cold. The shallow part of the lake near the shore was very transparent. He could clearly see the white stones at the bottom and the trees that had fallen for hundreds of millions of years. Looking into the distance, the lake became more and more blue. Tied by the mountains and cliffs on both sides, it was long and thin, extending to the depths of the wilderness in the extreme north. Ning Ke sat on the stone and looked at the beautiful lake view in front of him. He thought that yesterday he thought this blue lake looked like a kidney, which was really inelegant. In fact, it should be a woman's slender waist. The slightly swaying lake water was like a melting blue gem, pushing the thin ice condensed by the cold air to the lakeside piece by piece. Some gradually melted, and some overlapped. It was believed that as the winter became more and more intense, these thin ice would eventually become thick and hard ice cubes. Looking at the thin ice undulating with the lake, Ning Ke thought of the legendary people standing under the ice, and the things that he and Situ Ilan talked about when walking by the lake a few days ago. He could not help but show a self-deprecating emotion on his face. When people in the world reached a certain age, they always had to consider the marriage of men and women. He had never seriously considered it before, and indeed did not have any improper thoughts about Situ. But when he heard that Situ refused General Yun Hui, he still felt a little unhappy. Last spring at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road, he also had this kind of emotion. At that time, he was very clear that there was absolutely no possibility between him and Li Yu, the princess of Tang Empire. But when Li Yu left his shoulder and slowly stood up to restore her graceful appearance, there were still many inexplicable emotions in his heart. He scooped up a ladle of lake water and put out the remaining flames in the stone stove. He sat down by the lake again, looking at the thin ice that was more like sugar skin than glass, and said to himself with a slight mockery, "I forgot who said that there are only 2 kinds of women in the world, your own and others. Are all men like this?" This sentence was said by Lu Xiaohui, but he had always taught Sang Sang to remind himself that anyone who talked about feelings, especially love, was an idiot. So it did not take long for him to be immersed in this self-deprecating emotion. He was awakened by the horrible prospect that he might become an idiot, and began to think about some things that he thought were more meaningful now. He had been in the wilderness of northern Yan Kingdom for more than a month, but he had not seen Xiaoho. Naturally, he could not go to see him on behalf of His Majesty. Although Tiang's city was close, he was really not sure whether he should go or not. He also did not know what would happen if he met Xiaoho now. And although sporadic battles had been happening in the wilderness, the upper level of the Yan Kingdom's reinforcement army knew his identity and sent dozens of elites to protect him. So he could not fight to his heart's content. Was time going to pass like this? As a young man who had survived with great difficulty and lived better and better, Ning Ke was very clear about what he relied on to achieve this. So he would not allow himself to waste too much time. After thinking about meaningless things like men and women by the lake, and thinking about meaningful things like Xiaoho that he could not do anything about, he began to meditate and cultivate. A chilly wind blew from the surface of the lake, shaking the thin ice piled by the shore and the eyelashes on his tightly closed eyes. A slender Biyao rested on his knees. As he meditated, the invisible chi of heaven and earth gradually gathered around him and then gently covered the blade of the Biyao. The simple talisman lines engraved on the Biyao seemed to sense something. The shadow caused by the natural light suddenly became deeper than before, and then began to buzz and vibrate strangely. A piece of dry grass that was blown by the lake wind was bounced into the air as soon as it fell on the surface of the Biyao. It was instantly torn into hundreds of extremely thin grass by the invisible force, and then fell into the lake and disappeared. The Biyao across his knees was slightly vibrating, and the clear water between the white round stones by the lake in front of him was also slightly vibrating. The seemingly fragile but actually soft and sticky thin ice gradually shattered and scattered aimlessly along the lake waves, reflecting the sky, as if there were dozens of the same firmament. The big black umbrella, tightly wrapped in coarse cloth, lay silently beside him. After a long time, Ning Ke finished meditating. Looking at the broken ice between the white round stones in front of him, he knew that he would not stay in the no-doubt state for too long and had begun to approach the see-through state. When he was enlightened on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, he quickly broke through the initial state and the perception state and directly entered the no-doubt state. Even he himself did not know how he did it. So now he had no knowledge about cultivation and breaking the realm. At this time, he vaguely felt that he was about to break the realm, but he did not know how to do it. He was a little confused and thought, do I have to go to Tiang's city to send a full character letter to the senior brothers of the academy for advice? As he was thinking about this, he suddenly noticed that the thin ice piled up in front of him was getting more and more. Looking at the distance in front of his right hand, he saw many pieces of thin ice shining like a mirror were slowly flowing over. Having lived in the wilderness of Min Mountain for so many years, he was very familiar with the lakes in the wild. With just a few glances, he knew that there must be a hidden current in the lake, so that these thin ice could be pushed over. But this blue lake, which was as big as a beauty's waist, looked calm. Where did the hidden current come from? Knowing that no barbarians dared to come to this lakeside forest, there should not be any safety issues, he suddenly had the idea of exploring. He stood up, carried the heavy luggage, and moved upstream along the mirror-like thin ice. Going upstream, was there a beauty on the other side of the water? Walking along the lakeside for about a few miles, he could faintly see that there was a stream of water in front of him that was hitting the peaceful lake like a gem, creating countless beautiful small whirlpools. But the dense forest next to the pass, although the branches and leaves had already fallen, still covered the movement behind the forest, and he could not see the stream. Ning Ke knew that it was the paradise he was looking for. Smelling the faint smell of sulfur coming to his nose, he guessed that there might be a hot spring there, and he could not help but feel happy. Suddenly, a touch of jade white reflected in his eyes, and then a touch of blue flashed, just like this lake. Ning Ke's eyes suddenly showed vigilance, not because of the deep blue reflected in his eyes, but because of other reasons. He pulled the bow and arrow like lightning, aimed at somewhere in the dense forest, and said in a low voice, "Come out." There was a rustling sound in the forest, and a dozen young people slowly walked out. Some of them also aimed at Ning Kai with bows and arrows, but more of them looked at him vigilantly, holding the scabbard in their left hand and the hilt of the long sword outside the scabbard in their right hand. Ning Kai did not care about the sharp arrows aimed at him, but just calmly aimed at the youngest girl among these young people. The boxwood bow in his hand was as steady as a mountain, the string was stretched like a moon, and the arrow was as still as a lake stone. However, it gave people a feeling that as long as he wanted, the quiet arrow on the string would definitely shoot through the girl's chest in the next moment. This feeling was so strong that the nervous expressions of the few young people who aimed at Ning Kai stiffened, and the hands holding the slender long sword hilt turned slightly pale. As for the young girl who was targeted by Ning Kai's bow, her face was even paler, and her slightly bulging chest was violently heaving. A young man bravely jumped in front of the young girl, slightly bent his left knee forward, and took a forward horse stance. His left hand held the scabbard tightly, and his thumb faintly pressed against the ebony edge of the sword, and his right elbow bent backward to lift his wrist. Ning Kai looked at the posture of the young man holding the sword, and then glanced at the clothes and temperament of these young boys and girls. He guessed where they came from, and felt a little relieved. He looked at the young man who was holding the sword and said with a smile, "The cutting arrow style? It's useless against my arrows." The young man was despised by the enemy, and his face suddenly showed anger. "I am a Tang." Ning Kai told them where he came from, and then put down the boxwood bow in his hand. He did not look at these young people who were looking at him anxiously, and put the arrow back into the quiver. Since he had guessed the origin of this group of young boys and girls, he knew that there would be no problem. But because they obviously had no fighting experience, he put down his weapon first, in case they made mistakes because of nervousness. Sure enough, after hearing that he was a Tang, the young boys and girls who were still vigilant a moment ago suddenly became relaxed, and they put down their bows and loosened their sword hilts. "We are the disciples of the Black Ink Garden in the Great River Kingdom. After enduring for 3 days, I finally figured it out, but now I have to pick up my wife, so I will update first today. Tomorrow I will guarantee 6,000 yuan. Continue to ask for recommendation votes, and it will not be in vain. I will ask the second female lead who is about to appear to send you childhood photos of her and her crotch. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for recommendation votes and monthly votes. Your support is my biggest motivation." You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.